Section 16 of Augustus Caesar and the Organization of the Empire of Rome by John B. Firth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. The Romanization of the West. The pacification and reorganization of the West and the amazing success which attended the policy of Augustus in Gaul and Spain form perhaps the most enduring tribute to his careful statesmanship. Let us glance first at the 4 Gallic provinces, which covered practically the whole of modern France and Belgium. Cisalpine Gaul was now incorporated into the Italian peninsula. To the west of the Alps lay the province of Gallia Narbonensis, formed in the days of the Gracchi, extending from Lake Geneva on the eastern side and embracing the southern valleys of the Rhone, and then narrowing down to a thin strip of coastline towards the Pyrenees. The remainder of Gaul, fully 4/5 of the whole, had but recently been added to the Roman dominion by Julius Caesar. The more remote portions were still unsettled, but Julius had done his work well and in an almost inconceivably short space of time. He had not merely broken, but shattered the strength of the most warlike tribes, and 3 provinces were carved out of the vast region which Caesar had subdued. In the west lay the province of Aquitania, covering the watershed of the Garonne, with the Loire for its boundary on the north and east. The middle province, Lugdunensis, included Normandy and Brittany and a wide strip on the northern bank of the Seine, and then ran down through the center of the country to the Rhone, while the third province, Belgica, included at first all that remained of central and northeastern Gaul, and was bounded by the Atlantic and the Rhine, though subsequently the Rhine lands were taken from Belgica and formed, with a wide strip on the opposite bank, into the 2 border provinces of Higher and Lower Germany. Augustus and his generals first of all completed the conquests of Julius, and then gave the Gallic peoples stable and settled government. Aquitania was Iberian rather than Celtic, and its inhabitants belonged ethnically to the fierce tribes which dwelt in northern Spain, and not to those of central Gaul. Both slopes of the Pyrenees had been Iberian, and there is thus a close connection between the Spanish wars of BC 27 and 26 and the campaigns of Marcus Valerius Messala in Aquitania during the same period, when he routed the natives in a great battle just over the border of the adjoining province, near the city of Narbo. This consummated the victories gained by Agrippa in Aquitania 11 years before, and seems to have broken utterly the Iberian power, and in consequence thereof, Augustus was able to hand over to the Senate the province of Gallia Narbonensis in BC 22. Thenceforward, Gaul remained tranquil. No doubt, occasional punitive expeditions had to be undertaken, but none of these was sufficiently important to find a place in the annals of Roman history. And as no Gallic triumphs are recorded, the inference is that down to the rising in the reign of Tiberius in the year 21 AD, a rising which was speedily quelled by the legions of the frontier, the peace of Gaul was scarcely broken. 2 causes contributed to this grand result. One was the ruthless severity with which Julius had subdued the tribes. He had not hesitated to massacre as well as to slay, but if he showed no mercy towards the foe which opposed him in the field, he was generosity itself to the conquered when they had made their submission, and Augustus remained true to his uncle's policy. We may fairly compare their methods with those adopted, with equal success, by Russia in Central Asia, where in an equally short period the Turkomans and the Khanates of Transcaspia had been reduced to willing subjection. The Romans in Gaul did not worry the Celtic races. They did not dragoon them into accepting their superior civilization or interfere more than was absolutely necessary with the tribal customs to which the natives were passionately attached. And it is significant of the constant watch kept by Augustus over the Gallic provinces, and the assiduity with which he fostered their goodwill, that he not only repeatedly visited them in person, but sent thither, in the capacity of administrators as well as generals, the leading members of the imperial house. Augustus went to Gaul in 27 and completed the census of the province of Lugdunensis. In the year 20 BC, he was represented by his great minister, Agrippa. Later, he spent 3 whole years, 16 to 13 BC, in Gaul, and then, when he finally quitted it, he sent in turn Tiberius, Drusus, and Germanicus to build upon the foundations which he had laid. Augustus left the old cantonal system of the Celts intact. 64 cantons, or communal districts, continued to elect their ancient representative diet, which met at stated periods, and, subject to the supremacy of the imperial representative, governed its own local affairs. This diet was practically a national parliament of the 3 imperial Gallic provinces and assessed each canton for its share of the annual tribute. It assembled at Lugdunum, or Lyon, the Roman Burgess colony which had been founded by Plancus, and there chose the priest of the 3 Gauls, who was the head of the national religion, and celebrated the great festival of the emperor. That festival, inaugurated by Drusus in BC 12, when he consecrated at Lugdunum an altar to Rome and to the genius of the emperor, became thenceforth the most important event in the Gallic calendar. In accordance with the traditional policy of the Republic, Augustus willingly tolerated their national religion, and the Romans speedily identified many of the barbaric divinities of Gaul with the divinities of the Roman Olympus. If the tributes of Tyrannus were similar to those of Jupiter, or the qualities of Belenus and Belisana indistinguishable from those of Apollo and Minerva, it was a simple matter for Gaul and Roman to worship them under their double names, and it tended to unity that both conquerors and conquered should sacrifice upon a common altar. Whether these were the gods of Druidism, or whether the Druid religion was something special and distinct, we cannot stay to inquire. But it is at least certain that the Druid priests were the leaders of the extreme nationalist and irreconcilable party in Gaul, and that their rites involved human sacrifice, which the Roman emperor sternly refused to countenance. Parallels are dangerous, but it is tempting to draw one from India, where the policy of the British government is to afford complete toleration to the religious beliefs and practices of the natives, save where their rites involve the sacrifice of human life. And as the wildest and least tractable sects are invariably those whose rites are the most repugnant to the Western sentiment, so in Gaul we may well believe that the Druid priesthood, clinging tenaciously to its savagery, was also politically the most dangerous to the peaceful development of Gaul. Augustus gradually introduced measures tending to the repression of Druidism. He prohibited any Roman citizen from taking part in the rites, and with his usual sagacity, he sought to make the yearly festival of the Gallic Diet a counterpoise to the old annual assembly of the Celtic priests. Whether he took any active steps for the expulsion of the Druids is not stated, but at least the Druids found themselves driven to take shelter in the remoter districts of Armorica, and even to cross the Channel into Britain, and the next emperors were able boldly to prohibit the practice of the cult throughout their Gallic dominions. The festival of Rome and Augustus, held in Lugdunum, at which the national diet sacrificed and swore fealty to the emperor, became one of the strongest factors in the Romanization of the country. Augustus was content to let the seed which he had sown germinate in its own natural time. He did not flood the Gallic provinces with new colonies. Lugdunum remained the solitary Burgess colony in the 3 provinces. As the seat of both the imperial and the national administration, as the station of the Gallic mint and with a picked cohort for its permanent garrison, as the center of the great military roads which here converged from the most distant parts of the provinces, Lugdunum grew at a very rapid rate and became the focus of national life. So far as history has left any records, it was not until the reign of Claudius that Latin rights were conferred upon a Gallic town. Augustus was chary of bestowing either Roman or Latin rights upon the Gallic communities, and he even prohibited those Gauls who had attained to the full citizenship for services rendered to the state from entering upon the official career for which that citizenship qualified them in the eye of the law. In this respect, he departed from the policy of his uncle, who had admitted Gauls into the Senate. Why he took this narrow view, it is hard to say, unless it is to be explained by his strong conservatism and by his anxiety to check the intrusion of foreign elements into the Roman system. But he insisted that the Roman language should be adopted for all official purposes by the cantonal authorities and by the Diet of the 3 provinces. Modern experience has proved that there is no greater barrier to racial amalgamation than the presence of rival languages existing side by side, and the result of his wise enactment was that the Roman tongue at once became the tongue of the Gallic nobles and eventually the tongue of the whole country. Augustus's policy of judicious compromise, seen in the preservation of the old cantonal communities for purposes of local government and administration, but seen also in his restriction of the more fanatical forms of the native religion and the imposition of the Roman as the one official language of the country, bore a splendid harvest. When he died, the yoke of Rome over Celtic Gaul was hardly felt as the yoke of an alien power. The processes of amalgamation had not only begun, but were in full swing, and Gaul was already an integral part of the Roman world. In this brief review of what Augustus did for the 3 Celtic provinces, we have said nothing of the older province of Gallia Narbonensis on the Mediterranean littoral. This was now regarded as belonging rather to Italy than to Gaul, for whereas Augustus jealously withheld from Aquitania, Lugdunensis, and Belgica the Roman and Latin franchises, these were freely bestowed in Gallia Narbonensis. The cantons were strictly preserved in the one case, they were gradually done away with in the other. The territory which belonged to the ancient city of Massalia, or Marseille, had been stripped from her by Julius, and new Roman burgess colonies were planted within it. Forum Iulii, or Frejus, became the northern station of the imperial fleet, while at the mouth of the Rhone there sprang up the great trading city of Arelate, or Arles, which in course of time robbed Narbonne of much of its importance and struck a fatal blow at the waning commerce of Massalia. In addition to these Roman colonies, a number of other towns arose to which Augustus gave Latin rights. Nemausas, or Nimes, Aqua Sextia, or Aix, Avenio, or Avignon, Apta, or Apt, and many others covered the province with a chain of prosperous communities, while the older cities of Tolosa, or Toulouse, on the Aquitanian border, Vienna, or Vienne, on the Rhone, and Narbo shared in the general development. The Gaul absorbed the Roman in the north. In the south, the Roman absorbed the Gaul. What took place throughout Gaul was repeated across the Pyrenees in the great Spanish peninsula, but while the chief credit for the conquest of Gaul belongs to Julius, that of the final subjugation of Spain, with the exception of the old southern province of Baetica, belongs to Augustus and to his generals. The Republic had sunk millions of money in attempting the conquest of Spain. Army after army had been swallowed up in its plains and hills. It had come to be regarded as the grave of Roman reputations, and more than once the Senate had almost despaired of success. Triumphs in plenty had been won there, and the Republic boasted of 2 Spanish provinces, but the Iberian Peninsula had remained, except along the coast and in Baetica, practically unconquered and unsubdued, and was the natural refuge of lost causes and desperate rebellion. There was, indeed, a few flourishing towns, such as Italica, Corduba, Valentia, Gades, and Tarraco. Gnaeus Pompeius had freely distributed the citizenship, and Julius, liberal-handed as ever, had followed his rival's example. Yet the whole of Lusitania, or Portugal, was in the hands of the natives. The north of Spain was held by the unbroken tribes of Iberians and Galatians, and the vast central districts of the Cantabrians were only quiet while their inhabitants were silently preparing for war. Roman armies had often marched through their midst and received their submission, but at the first favorable opportunity the natives had again sprung to arms. Thus we find that in the period between the death of Julius and the Battle of Actium, 6 Roman governors had won triumphs in Spain, a fact which points, if not to sweeping victories, at least to almost incessant warfare. We have already spoken of Augustus's long stay in Spain from BC 27 to 24, years which his lieutenants spent in battle while their chief was planting new colonies and perfecting his organization of the military lines of communication. No sooner had he returned to Rome than the Cantabrians and Asturians broke out in open revolt, and it was not until the year 19 BC, when Agrippa was sent to take control of the operations in the field, that the Cantabrians were finally subdued. Agrippa routed them from their mountain fastnesses and settled them in the plains, and from that time onward there was peace in Spain. The peninsula, which for 200 years had been the constant theater of harassing warfare, became the most peaceful portion of the Roman Empire during the next 3 centuries. Augustus divided Spain into 3 provinces. Out of the old inchoate province of Further Spain, he carved Baetica, which he soon handed over to the Senate, and Lusitania, which still required a considerable garrison. To Hither Spain he gave the name of Tarraconensis, from its new capital of Tarraco, which was the usual port of entry for those who approached the country by sea from Italy. We have the express testimony of Strabo, writing but a few years later, that the natives of Baetica had already adopted the manners and customs of the Romans so thoroughly that they had become strangers to their mother tongue. They were almost Romans. They prided themselves on wearing the toga. Augustus dealt generously with them in the bestowal of the Latin rites, and the 2 new Burgess colonies of Hispalis or Seville and Astigi or Essahia became fresh centers of Roman influence. Even in Cicero's time, Cordoba could boast its native literati, who ventured to sing in Roman measures. They excited, it is true, only his derision and contempt. Yet a generation later, the Roman poets of the Augustan age found no more enthusiastic readers than among the Spanish provincials, who were soon to send to Rome itself teachers, poets, philosophers, and even emperors. The Roman lives and treasure which had been poured out in Spain were not wasted, for Spain gave new and vigorous blood to the empire and amply repaid the debt. In Lusitania and Tarraconensis, the Romanizing process was more slow, but it was none the less sure. Roads were the great highways of civilization then, as railways are now, and Augustus thrust his military roads tirelessly forward, with permanent garrisons planted at the chief strategical points. In the region of the Ebro, he set his new colonies at Salsa, Caesar Augusta, and Dertosa, Legio Septima, or Leon, and Asturica, or Asturga, mounted guard in the Asturias, while in modern Portugal, the familiar names of Lisbon, Badajoz, and Merida are but corruptions of the Roman names of the military colonies which overawed the hardy mountaineers of ancient Lusitania. 50 tribes which were once constantly at war with one another now live in peace by the side of the Italian colonists, wrote Strabo. Even so late as the time of Sertorius, says Velleius Paterculus, it seems doubtful which was the stronger and which would prove the master, the Roman or the Spaniard. But now the provinces which hardly knew respite from wars of first-class magnitude are so profoundly peaceful that they scarcely harbor a single brigand. There is Velleius's usual note of exaggeration here, the touch of the partisan journalist rather than the sober historian, but the main point is true. Thanks to Augustus, Spain became a source of strength to the empire instead of weakness. And in grateful recognition of her regenerator's work, she continued down to the late Middle Ages to reckon the years from the date of his accession, and was proud to live under the dispensation of Augustus. End of section 16. Section 17 of Augustus Caesar and the Organization of the Empire of Rome by John B. Firth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. The Eastern Frontier. The problem raised by the eastern frontier was essentially different from the rest, for here alone Augustus had to deal not with barbarians or semi-barbarians, but with an organized empire, a power with which he could treat accordingly to the usages of diplomacy. That power was Parthia. The treaties of peace with Parthia, made by Gnaeus Pompeius, the Euphrates had been fixed as the boundary of Syria as far north as Edessa, and the river, with the Mesopotamian deserts on the eastern bank, formed a natural frontier. But coterminous with the vassal principalities of Commagene, Cappadocia, Lesser Armenia, and Pontus, which stretched from that point to the Euxine, lay Armenia, and here was the standing cause of quarrel between Rome and Parthia. Nominally, Armenia was an independent kingdom, with a royal house of its own, but Parthian influence had long been supreme within its borders. Owing to its strategical position, which was exactly similar to that of Afghanistan at the present day in relation to Russian Asia and British India, the policy of Rome was directed towards making Armenia its ally, so that, in the eventuality of a war with Parthia, the legions might not have to fight their way through the Armenian passes. Roman interests in the country were almost wholly military and strategic, and the Senate had sedulously fostered the formation of a pro-Roman party in Armenia, though it is abundantly clear that the general sympathies of the people favored the old Parthian alliance. Armenia thus became Roman and Parthian in turn, according as the throne was filled by a Roman or a Parthian nominee. We have narrated in an earlier chapter the campaigns of Antonius in this region, and we have seen how he placed one of his own children by Cleopatra on the Armenian throne. But after the battle of Actium, Armenia rose and thrust out the intruder, and the new monarch signalized his accession by a general massacre of the Romans throughout his country, in revenge for the cruel murder of his father by Antonius. It was doubtless expected, by public opinion at Rome, that Augustus would lose no time in avenging this massacre by leading his legions, fresh from the conquest of Egypt, into Armenia, and restoring the Roman ascendancy. But he did nothing of the kind. If there was one clear lesson taught by the repeated Eastern campaigns of recent years, it was that they pointed straight to disaster. Augustus declined to regard the anti-Parthian policy of Julius and Antonius as an integral part of his inheritance, and he accepted the position as he found it. It was not a heroic policy. Julius would probably have made the loss of Armenia an immediate casus belli with Parthia, but its wisdom was justified by the event. Augustus had the entire Roman world to set in order, and was willing to wait until a more convenient season. Yet though he refrained from war, he came to no definite accommodation with the Parthian king. The loss of the eagles of Crassus at Carrhae, and the two subsequent defeats which had befallen Antonius's lieutenants, Decius Saxa and Statianus, were blots upon the Roman military honor which had to be wiped out, sooner or later. Public opinion might acquiesce in a temporary, it would not have acquiesced in a permanent, abandonment of Armenia. Augustus, therefore, merely postponed the struggle and remained on the watch for a moment when his hands should be free and Parthia should be weak. It came at length. There were always Parthian, Armenian, and Median kings in exile, and to these Augustus gave asylum and helped them to foster dissension across the borders. He installed the dispossessed king of the Medes in Lesser Armenia, and lent arms and money to the Parthian pretender Tiridates. Phraates, anxious for his throne, opened communications with Augustus, who in turn pressed for the restoration of the standards of Crassus, but there was no good faith on either side, and the negotiations came to naught. However, in BC 20, a powerful faction arose in Armenia against the reigning king, and sent a deputation to Augustus, begging him to place on the throne Tigranes, the king's brother, who had been brought up in the palace at Rome. Augustus was then at Samos and acceded to their wishes. He sent a powerful army into Armenia under the command of his stepson Tiberius, then 22 years of age, and a bloodless victory was obtained. The king of Armenia was murdered by his own relatives. Tigrades received his crown as a vassal of Rome from the hands of Tiberius, and the throne of Armenia was once more filled by a Roman feudatory. In the neighboring country of Media Atropatene, another prince, equally friendly to Rome, was installed, and the king of Parthia, alarmed at the presence of the legions upon the Araxes, hastened to make his peace with Augustus. He restored the long-lost standards of Crassus and the remnant of the Roman prisoners who had survived their 30 years' captivity, and the delight of Augustus at having thus rehabilitated the Roman prestige, without risking the desperate uncertainties of war, knew no bounds. The court poets sang their paeans of victory in unmeasured strains, and Augustus sent valuable gifts to the Parthian king. Among his presents was a beautiful Italian woman named Thermusa, who became the favorite mistress of the king, and played the part of Roman ambassadress so well that she induced Phraates to send his children as hostages to Rome. In the Monumentum Ancyrum, Augustus declares that Phraates sought his alliance, not after suffering a defeat in war, but of his own free will, by sending the royal children as pledges of his sincerity. It is more probable that the conciliatory attitude of the Parthian was due to the troubled state of his kingdom, and the fact that the mysterious ambassadors from King Pandion of Scythia and King Porus of India were seeking alliance with Rome may also have influenced his actions. This settlement of the Eastern question lasted for about 14 years. Then the king of Armenia died, and acting upon the instigation of Parthia, his son assumed the crown without consulting the Roman overlord. Augustus again ordered Tiberius to lead an expedition thither, but he declined the commission, and Varus, who took his place, set Artavasdes on the throne. Artavasdes, however, proved an intractable vassal, and in the year 1 BC, Augustus dispatched the young Caius Caesar, his eldest grandson by the marriage of Julia and Agrippa, at the head of an important mission to the east. There is a mystery attaching to this mission which has never been cleared up. No expedition which Augustus sanctioned was never so magniloquently written up by the court poets at Rome. They set forth, in the most extravagant vein, the vastness of its scope. Caius, so the world was told, was commissioned not only to set the affairs of Armenia in order, but to lead the Roman armies into Parthia, destroy that empire, penetrate down the valley of the Euphrates to the Persian Gulf, and then conquer and annex Arabia. The campaign, in other words, was to be ordered on such a scale as that on which Alexander or Julius would have conceived it. There is something suspicious in all this bombast when one remembers the character of Augustus and the extreme youth of Caius. It was not the wont of the emperor to trumpet forth his intentions and disclose his plans of campaign. May we not surmise that he was playing a great game at bluff with Parthia? It is difficult on any other theory to explain why 2 years were thrown away by Caius in Syria, while his tutor, Lollius, intrigued with and received bribes from the Parthian. The young commander-in-chief, who was to emulate the exploits of Alexander, showed himself much more anxious to negotiate than to fight, and we can hardly doubt that his line of policy was dictated from Rome. A meeting was eventually arranged to take place upon an island in the Euphrates, and a treaty was drawn up whereby Phraates pledged himself to interfere no more in the affairs of Armenia, where the timely death of Artavasdes prepared the way for the accession of Tigranes, a prince of the old royal house. War with Parthia, therefore, was again averted by diplomacy, and it is hard to resist the suspicion that this was as agreeable to Augustus as it was to Phraates. All the projects, real or pretended, for a great campaign of conquest in the East fell to the ground and were heard of no more, and the net result of Caius's mission was the restoration of Armenia to the sphere of Roman influence, and a renewed understanding with Parthia, which remained unbroken throughout the remainder of Augustus's reign. The emperor's supreme gratification at this success was tempered only by his grief at the death of Caius, who succumbed after a long illness to the effects of a wound which he had received from a treacherous Parthian officer before the Armenian stronghold of Artagira. It is clear, therefore, that the guiding principle of Augustus's Eastern policy was the avoidance of a serious war on any terms short of national dishonor. He rightly judged that the problems of the Danube and the Rhine were of a much more vital importance to the empire than the problems arising out of the eastern frontier, and that Parthia was only dangerous to an invader and was herself in process of rapid decay. He adopted a strictly conservative attitude and did not seek to extend his boundaries. He might have made Armenia a province. He preferred, as he says in the Monumentum and Chirum, to hand it over to Tigriades. And he was wise, for he had no spare legions to act as its garrison. While, therefore, it cannot be said that Augustus secured a scientific frontier in the East, for the disadvantages of the buffer state and the vassal kingdom policy are obvious, it was none the less tolerably secure on account of the internal weakness of Parthia. And the rich province of Syria, which, after all, was the emperor's principal care in this region, was absolutely safeguarded by the Euphrates and the 4 legions of the Syrian campaign. Its capital, Antioch, was the 3rd city of the empire in point of population, and almost surpassed Rome itself in its luxury and devotion to pleasure. Syria was a great manufacturing center. It was the emporium through which passed most of the overland traffic with the Far East, and the Phoenician harbors were busy hives of industry. Poor and desolate though it now is, in the time of Augustus, it was a land overflowing with corn, wine, and oil, and one of the wealthiest provinces of the empire. We have already alluded to the vassal kingdoms of the interior of Asia Minor, with the exception of Galatia, which was incorporated in BC 25, on the death of King Amyntas. These remained untouched by Augustus. Galatia itself was probably annexed on account of the turbulent condition of Isauria and Pisidia, where the emperor planted a few small colonies of veterans. The others retained their semi-independence. The remainder of Asia Minor had fallen to the Senate in the great division of the provinces. Cilicia, from its proximity to Syria, was afterwards transferred to the emperor, but the authority of the Senate was supreme in Asia and Bithynia, in the flourishing Greek cities which fringed the whole coastline, and in the islands of Cyprus and Crete. The state of Greece calls for a passing word. Hellas had fallen into a most deplorable and desolate condition, and the whole of Greece, south of Thessaly, was now known to the Romans by the name of Achaia. Athens, still the home of philosophy and rhetoric, was merely a small university city, a pleasant place of resort and retreat. Her commerce had dwindled to a vanishing point. Her harbors at Phalerum were empty of ships, her temples were falling into decay, and her case was typical of the rest. Corinth was in ruins and had never risen from the ashes in which Memmius had laid her. The Peloponnese was a howling wilderness. Magnarum rerum, magna sepulchra vides. That mournful line, which conjures up before the imagination the graves of dead cities, tells its own tale of silent oracles and vanished policies. Greece had been on the side of Pompeius in the war with Julius. She had been on the side of Antonius in the war with Augustus. She had been stripped bare to furnish supplies for the hosts which had fought out their quarrels in Thessaly, Macedonia, and at Actium, and was now prostrate. To infuse new life into so exhausted a frame was almost hopeless, but Augustus attempted even this. Athens was punished for the favor she had shown to Antonius and Cleopatra by being deprived of Aegina and Megara, but an additional batch of colonists was sent to Corinth, and new colonies were founded at Patria and at Buthrontum in Epirus. Augustus had already laid the foundations of a great city at Nicopolis to celebrate his supreme victory, and with that spirit of conservatism which marked all his acts, he re-established the Amphictyonic Council for Greece, Macedonia, and Thessaly. To this council, however, Nicopolis alone sent 6 deputies, as many as either Macedonia or Thessaly. Boeotia, Phocis, and Delphi sent 2 each. Doris, Athens, Euboea, Opontian Lorcus, and Ozonian Locris had 1 representative each, while Argos, Sicyon, Corinth, and Megara had to combine to supply a single deputy. There could be no more startling proof of the utter degradation into which the cities of Greece had fallen. The province of Achaia, which at the redistribution of the provinces had been given to the Senate, was 12 years later combined with the imperial province of Macedonia, but was again restored to the Senate by Claudius. Greece had ceased to count, and alone of all the many provinces of the Roman Empire, she continued to decay. Her sun had set. Thessaly and Macedonia fared better than the southern portion of the peninsula and received new colonies of veterans. Thrace, throughout the reign of Augustus, was ruled by native chiefs friendly to Rome and steadily grew more civilized, as the formation of the province of Moesia and the legions on the Danube protected it from the incursions of the wild tribes of Dacia. The trading cities on the Thracian coast of the Euxine, in the Crimea, and in Colchis maintained a more or less precarious existence in the midst of barbarism and can have contributed little to the revenues of the empire. End of section 17. Section 18 of Augustus Caesar and the Organization of the Empire of Rome by John B. Firth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. Egypt, Africa, and Palestine. When Augustus divided the Roman world between himself and the Senate, he carefully excluded from this partition the ancient kingdom of Egypt, which remained during his reign and for several centuries after his death on a different footing from every other province, senatorial or imperial. Though incorporated in the empire, it never formally ranked as a province. For all practical purposes, it was an appanage of the Principate and almost a private estate of the ruling emperor. Augustus forbade any senator from setting foot upon its soil. He chose its governors from the ranks of the knights, from those, that is to say, who had no imperium because they had never held either the praetorship or the consulship. As the conqueror of Cleopatra and the heir by conquest of the Legid dynasty, he entered into possession of vast royal domains. As the ruler of Egypt, he became lord of a patient, industrious, and submissive nation of agriculturalists, accustomed by centuries of obedience to pay heavy taxes without a murmur. The fact that the emperor annually obtained from the Nile land 20 million bushels of wheat, a third part of the entire consumption of the capital, as well as an enormous tribute in hard cash, explains why he and his successors attached such prime importance to Egypt and took such extraordinary care over the details of its administration. The general who held Egypt held one of the keys of Rome. This was one of the fundamental principles of imperial policy. Augustus did wisely, therefore, to keep the Egyptian governorship, a post of such magnitude that Strabo said, "The official who is sent to Egypt occupies the place of a king," for members of his own entourage, upon whose fidelity he could place the most absolute reliance. Cornelius Gallus, who had accompanied Augustus to Alexandria after the Battle of Actium, was the first imperial prefect of Egypt, and the position seems to have turned his brain. We are told that he carried his presumption to the point of having his name inscribed upon the pyramids, not in the stupid but harmless spirit which has prompted countless generations of tourists to imitate his example, but in the spirit of overweening vanity which is bred in small minds by a sense of power. Gallus fell from favor. He was disgraced and ordered back to Rome for trial, where the emperor bitterly complained of his ingratitude and malevolence. Yet when it seemed likely that the Senate would pass a harsh sentence upon him, Augustus declared that he was the only man in Rome to whom it was not permitted to be angry with his friends. Augustus's policy in Egypt, as elsewhere, was to interfere as little as possible with existing institutions, social, economic, and political. There had been no self-government under the Ptolemies like that which the Romans had found in Syria. The country had been parceled out into 36 districts or nomes, the entire administration of which was conducted by royal officials. Practically the only change made by Augustus was to install Roman officials and to divert the revenues into his own exchequer. He did not seek to Romanize the country, for not a single colony was planted within its borders. His main object was merely to keep the milk cow in good condition. Then, as now, the prosperity of the land depended upon two conditions: the annual overflow of the Nile, and the system of irrigation works. When Augustus set his legions, greatly no doubt to their annoyance and disgust, to clean out the canals which the luxurious and effeminate Ptolemies had allowed to become choked with mud, he gave signal proof that he understood the needs of Egypt. The result was that whereas when the Romans incorporated the country, it required a Nile overflow of 14 cubits to ensure a full harvest, it soon only required an overflow of 12, and the 8 cubits, which previously had spelt famine, now represented a fair and sufficient harvest. Augustus not only saw the commercial and strategical importance of Egypt, but embarked upon very speculative military operations in Arabia in order to destroy a commercial rival. The campaign of Aelius Gallus in 25 BC is inexplicable except on the supposition that it was a trade war. There were two main trading routes between India and Europe. One lay along the valley of the Euphrates, through Parthia into Syria. The other passed through Arabia and what is now the province of Yemen. The ruins of immense reservoirs cut out of the solid rock at Aden still bear witness to the vanished civilization which once flourished in this barren region, and the name of Arabia Felix attests its wealth and importance in Roman times. From the cities of the Yemen, the caravan route traversed the Arabian shore of the Red Sea, through Lus Comé, the modern Havara, to Berenice at the head of the Sinaitic Peninsula, and thence crossed the Idumean desert to Petra, the capital of the Nabatean Syrians, and so to the ports of Gaza and Rhinocolura. This route did not touch Egypt at all, and the alternative route from Berenice across the Sinaitic Peninsula to Arsinoe, close by the modern Suez, whence goods might be conveyed through the canal, dug ages before by an enlightened pharaoh, which connected the salt lakes with the Nile, and so down to the sea at Pelusium, was little used because the canal was choked. Augustus's main efforts were directed to the reopening of a third, but also disused, route to the Far East, which avoided the long tracks across the deserts of Arabia. It lay up the Nile as far as Coptos, near Thebes. Their goods were transported over the desert to the Red Sea, either to Myos Hormos, to Leucos Limen, or to Berenice Troglodyxi, the 3 Egyptian ports of the Red Sea, whence they might be shipped direct to their destinations. The pirates of the Arabian Gulf were rigorously suppressed, and we are told that fleets of 120 sail used to leave annually for India from the port of Myos Hormos alone in the latter days of Augustus. Here then we have a clear explanation of the cause which led to the campaign of Aelius Gallus. The active development of this Nile and oversea route threatened to ruin the carrying trade of the Homerites in Arabia Felix, and they doubtless retaliated by harrying the Egyptian merchantmen. An expedition to reduce them to subjugation was the natural result. It proved a most inglorious fiasco, for it was wretchedly mismanaged by the Roman commander. He collected a fleet of 80 warships and 130 transports, together with an army of 10,000 men and contingents furnished by the Natabians and the Jews, and set sail from Arsinoe. But instead of being taken direct to its objective, the force was landed at Lus Comé, halfway down the Red Sea, and spent 180 days in reaching Meribah, the capital of the Sabaeans, to which Gallus laid siege. During these 6 months, his army had been wasted by the diseases which are endemic in the country, and by the enormous difficulties incident to campaigning in the desert, and so after spending 6 days before the walls of Meribah, Gallus ordered a retreat, and the army retraced its steps to Lus Comé, having accomplished nothing, and without even reaching the Homerite territory. No second expedition for the conquest of Arabia was attempted by Augustus. But there is reason to believe that before the close of his reign, a Roman fleet made its way down to Aden and reduced that city to the position of a mere village. Certainly the Red Sea became Roman water, and the trade of the Far East was largely diverted from the old caravan route through Arabia into the Egyptian ports and the Nile route, to the great profit of the Egyptian revenue. The southern border of Egypt was fixed at Syene, where the first cataract interrupted the navigability of the Nile, and Augustus steadily refused to listen to the advocates of a forward policy against Ethiopia. When Gaius Petronius had beaten back the armies of the Ethiopian queen, who had taken advantage of the absence of Aelius Gallus in Arabia to raid across the border, Augustus declined even to demand tribute or formal submission. In the closing years of his reign, when his legions were hard pressed on the Nile and the Danube, he must have congratulated himself upon his wise determination not to be drawn into the deserts of the Sudan. His policy in Africa was guided by similar considerations. The Atlas Mountains in the far west and the great deserts of the Sahara formed a natural boundary across which he was not tempted to pass, but even within these limits there was much work to be done. The Republic had not conquered the whole of the Mediterranean littoral. Practically the only parts which were thoroughly Roman were the ancient territory of Carthage and the Pentapolis of the Cyrenaic. The Roman province of Africa was rich in grain, but its compass was small, and it was hemmed in on the land side by the kingdom of Numidia, with which the Republic had been constantly at war. To the west lay the two Mauritanian kingdoms, afterwards known as Mauritania Tingitana and Mauritania Caesarensis. When, after the battle of Thapsus, the larger part of Numidia, which formed the hinterland of Roman Africa, was incorporated into that province, the two Mauritanian kings who had supported Julius were rewarded by an increase of territory. Subsequently, in the quarrels between Antonius and Octavian, Bogud espoused the cause of the former and lost his throne, which was given to Bocchus. The latter died in BC 33, and the whole of Western Africa was bestowed by Augustus in BC 25 upon the son of the last king of Numidia, who had been brought up at Rome under the guidance of Augustus and had been married to a daughter of Cleopatra and Antonius. The young Juba amply fulfilled the trust reposed in him. He and his son after him continued to rule Mauritania as vassals of the Roman emperor until Caligula summoned Ptolemaeus to Rome, put him to death, seized his treasure, and annexed his kingdom. The only campaign of note waged in North Africa during the reign of Augustus took place in what is now Tripoli, the eastern part of the senatorial province of Africa. Lucius Cornelius Balbus penetrated into the Sahara in BC 19 as far as the oasis of Fenzin and annexed the district. His was the last senatorial triumph. Henceforward, the distinction was reserved for those who wore the purple or belonged to the reigning house. Cyrenaica, which together with the island of Crete formed another senatorial province and is scarcely mentioned throughout this period. But beyond doubt, the beginning of the imperial administration witnessed a remarkable revival of prosperity all along the southern shore of the Mediterranean. Augustus sent a new detachment of veterans to Carthage to strengthen the colony which Julius had planted there, and Carthage speedily became, for the second time, the Queen of Africa, rivaling even Alexandria in opulence and in the volume of its trade. And while Alexandria continued to be essentially Hellenistic, Carthage was Roman to the core. A number of settlements with Latin rites were formed not only on the coast but far in the interior, and the Romanization of northern Africa proceeded as rapidly as that of Gallia Narbonensis or Baetica. Its civilization was destined to be blotted out absolutely by barbarism just when it was in the height of its glory, but its sand-strewn ruins still testify to the completeness of the Roman occupation and to the marvelous prosperity which it attained as early as the days of the Antonines. The affairs of Judea and Palestine also claim attention by reason of the special interest which attaches to this relatively insignificant quarter of the empire, as the birthplace of Christ and as the home of the race which proved so sharp a thorn in the side of the Roman government. It does not fall within the limits of this volume to trace the downfall of the Maccabean family and the rise to power of the bloodstained and ferocious, yet capable and astute, Herod, who was known even to his contemporaries as Herod the Great. During his entire career, Herod remained consistently faithful to the party which ruled the East. He was a Caesarian while Julius lived. When Cassius was arming the East for the Republic, he too was on the Republican side. When Octavian and Antonius divided the world, he ranged himself under the standard of Antonius. Always a vassal king, he accepted without demur the foreign policy of his master of the moment, and even though Antonius lavished some of Herod's southern districts upon Cleopatra and her children, the supple Idumean acquiesced with good grace and employed his soldiers to collect the tribute for her. So that he kept his crown, Herod's loyalty was beyond reproach. Then, when the fortunes of Antonius sank at Actium and the victor was preparing to invade Egypt, Herod was swift to enter into negotiations with Octavian and transfer his allegiance to the new overlord. His capacity was well known and his power was considerable. Octavian was anxious to keep the Jews quiet, and gladly accepted the overtures of Herod, whose kingdom was subsequently extended by the inclusion of Joppa and Gaza on the south, and by the incorporation of the districts of Etruria, Batanea, Auranitis, and Trachonitis, which lay east of the Sea of Galilee and stretched north to Damascus. In other words, he ruled over the whole of Palestine in its greatest extent, and none of the other semi-independent kings of the East enjoyed such liberty of action and so many privileges as he. Judea proper paid no tribute to Rome, whatever imposts were levied on the other districts, and the central government pursued a rigid policy of non-interference. Augustus, we may suspect, was only too glad to be relieved from the duty of directly governing what Cicero, years before, had described as a suspicious and spiteful state. Tam suspiciosa ac maledica civitas. Herod made an admirable warden of the march, or, in a more homely phrase, a trustworthy watchdog at the gates of Egypt. There was little profit to be wrung out of Palestine, and Jews in their own country were harmless as long as they were left to themselves. Unfortunately, however, both for Rome and Palestine, Herod's rule was detested by his Jewish subjects. Though he raised their status among the nations, the fierce national spirit of the priestly theocracy was against him. Herod was only half a Jew. His sympathies were Hellenist. And while he rebuilt the temple on a most magnificent scale, he also introduced into Jerusalem a circus and an amphitheater, things which were anathema to the fanatical priests. His united kingdom was divided at his death in BC 4 among his three sons, Philip, Antipas, and Archelaus, neither of whom inherited the capacity of his father. Archelaus, in Judea, began his reign by appointing a new high priest who was obnoxious to the people of Jerusalem, and the inevitable tumult followed. Varus, the Roman governor of Syria, was obliged to intervene to restore order, and a deputation of Jews was sent to petition Augustus at Rome. The emperor confirmed, in the main, the testament of Herod, while withholding the kingly title from Archelaus, but soon found it necessary to depose him, and in answer to the solicitations of the Jews themselves, Judea was declared in AD 6 a Roman province of the second rank, an annexee, as it were, of the province of Syria. A small Roman garrison took up its quarters in the castle at Jerusalem, but Caesarea was the center of the Roman administration. The arrangements made by Augustus for the government of Judea were equitable and just. The tribute, of course, was exacted as in every other Roman province, but the urban communities were granted self-government, and Jerusalem was left to the control of the Jewish Sanhedrin with complete judicial and executive authority, subject only to the confirmation of the death sentence by the Roman procurator. The emperor carefully respected the religious prejudices of the Jews, to which they attached far higher importance than to the good government of their land. Special coins were struck which did not bear the effigy of the emperor. The troops left their eagles and standards at Caesarea before marching to Jerusalem. Augustus and Livia sent sumptuous gifts to the temple and paid the cost of daily sacrifice on the great altar, and it was made a crime punishable by death for a Gentile, even if he were a Roman citizen, to profane the inner court by entering it. Such enactments show the extraordinary pains taken by the central government to conciliate the Jews and to prevent the Roman yoke, imposed, be it noted, at their own request. from chafing their necks. Many a Roman procurator of Judea found himself sacrificed in the vain hope of placating the Jewish national sentiment. Such then was the policy of Augustus towards the Jews in their own country. While the strong man, Herod the Great, lived, he was well satisfied that another should rule so stubborn a race. When Herod died, and the incapacity of his sons became manifest, he sought to secure at least a tolerable working arrangement by strict non-interference in the internal affairs of Judea, provided there was no actual revolt. Yet he must have felt that just as Druid worship was the storm center in Gaul, so the fierce uncompromising character of the Jewish religion was the storm center in the East, and that sooner or later it would have to be crushed in its home at Jerusalem by the whole might of Rome. The Jewish problem, however, was by no means confined to the barren hills and deserts of Palestine. The Jews were scattered throughout the empire, clannish and exclusive beyond any people that the world had ever seen, formed colonies of their own in every great city, submissive to the law, intent only upon money-making, and antisocial to a man. The uneasy distrust and suspicion with which they were regarded by the Romans was perfectly natural. The Jews took no part in the life of the communities into which they had thrust themselves. They held aloof from festivals. They did not aspire to obtain the citizenship, for its privileges entailed obligations and expense. Cicero, in a striking passage in the Pro Flacco, which goes to the very root of this distrust, had declared that the Jewish religion looked askance at the splendor of the Roman Republic, at the majesty of the Roman name, and at the time-honored institutions of Rome. Even the poorest Jew despised the Roman gods and the civilizing mission of Rome, and despised, while accepting, the toleration which was offered him. The cultured Roman, in return, was contemptuous of the one jealous and conquered deity, who would not fraternize with his brother divinities, while the poorer Roman hated the morose Semite, whom he could not understand. The Jews formed practically an imperium in imperio, paying the annual tribute of the double drachma to the funds of the foreign temple at Jerusalem, a mysterious race which by its very persistence inspired not only hate but fear. They were now securely planted in the East, notably in Alexandria and the Greek cities of Asia Minor, and there was a colony of 8,000 Jews in Jerusalem itself. Augustus, continuing the policy of Julius, which in this respect had been the policy of Alexander the Great, confirmed the Eastern Jews in their old privileges and gave them more. They were exempted from military service. The strict regulations against corporate societies and unions were abated in their favor, and when the Greek communities of Asia Minor sought to include them in the general levy, Augustus expressly ratified the Jewish protest. In Alexandria and Cyrene, the Jews had an ethnarch of their own. In Antioch, Ephesus, and other cities, they enjoyed a similarly favored position. It would seem almost as if Augustus set himself to make the Jews of the diaspora pro-Roman, as a counterpoise in some degree to the prevailing Hellenism of the East. They had no political organization. Their interests were entirely centered in their trade and their religion. But he adopted a different policy towards them in the West. There is no evidence that he imposed any check upon their freedom of movement, but certainly in no Western city do we find them possessing the practical autonomy which they enjoyed in Alexandria. A sharp distinction was drawn between the provinces of Western Europe, which it was the aim of the emperor to Romanize, and the provinces of the East, which had been thoroughly Hellenized long before the Romans set foot within them. End of section 18. Section 19 of Augustus Caesar and the Organization of the Empire of Rome by John B. Firth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. The Danube and the Rhine. It remains to consider the policy of Augustus in relation to the northern frontier of the empire. Elsewhere, he practically accepted the boundaries which had been bequeathed to him by Julius and the Republic. Here he marked out new frontiers of his own and engaged, sometimes vigorously, sometimes reluctantly, in the work of expansion. It will be most convenient in the course of this chapter to present a brief connected story of the wars which he waged in order to thrust forward his boundaries to the Danube, the Rhine Delta, and the German Ocean. We shall then see the legions advance through Germany to the Weser and the Elbe, and finally, after suffering one great military disaster, draw back to the valley of the Rhine. The Republic had looked to the north with eyes apprehensive of barbaric invasion rather than eager with the hope of conquest. There had, it is true, been endless petty wars in the province of Cisalpine Gaul on the southern slopes of the Alps, and constant campaigns at the head of the Adriatic against the tribes of Illyricum, but broadly speaking, one may say that the Republic had been content to allow the northern regions of Italy to remain in the hands of the hillmen, who, from time to time, pillaged and harried the dwellers in the valleys, even when the Roman arms were subduing powerful nations in Spain, Africa, and the East. Italy, in fact, was not mistress of her own household until the time of Augustus, and he had started his career of conquest, not in the north, but in the northeast, and had begun his long series of annexations by moving towards the Danube. As far back as BC 35, Augustus had undertaken his first campaign in Pannonia against the Eopides, and advanced to the Save, where he captured the Pannonian capital of Siscia, and in the course of the next 2 years settled a number of military posts along the coast of Istria and Dalmatia. The occupation of part of Pannonia was intended primarily to prepare the way for a campaign against the Dacians, who were threatening the security of Macedonia and the coast towns of Thrace. In the Monumentum Ancyrum, Augustus declares that he never waged war in a wanton spirit of conquest, and Suetonius similarly states that he never took up arms without just and necessary cause. We know so little of what took place behind the screen of the Alps and the Danube that it is almost impossible to discuss the justice of this claim. The fact seems to be that threatening confederations of the tribes were formed periodically as capable warriors rose to power amongst them, and that the Romans and friendly natives who dwelt on the borders were constantly menaced by a flood of barbarian invasion. The client states of Rome clamored for protection, and even in the time of Julius, the Dacians, under Burebista, had swept down as far as Apollonia in a great devastating raid. Antonius himself had helped to drive them back, and then Augustus, when his hands were free from the Battle of Actium, sent in BC 29 his lieutenant, Marcus Licinius Crassus, to inflict the punishment which had been so long delayed. The expedition was successful. The king of the Bastarnae was defeated and slain. Crassus advanced to the Danube in its lower reaches, and the foundations were laid of what subsequently became the province of Moesia. The tribe suffered so severely that we hear of no more campaigns in that region until after the lapse of 17 years, the barbarians on the farther side of the Danube once more collected for a rush across the river. Augustus then proceeded to break up the hill tribes which dwelt among the Rhaetian and Cottian Alps. The task was one which could no longer be postponed. Rome needed a secure and direct highway into Gaul, and the passes were in the hands of warlike peoples, as difficult to deal with and as little to be depended upon as the Aphrodis and Waziris on the northwest frontiers of India. One tribe alone was spared, in recognition of the loyalty of its king, Cotius, who, under Roman direction, opened up a great road over Mount Cenis. Cotius's capital lay on the Segusio, or Susae, and the 2 new Roman colonies founded by Augustus at Seleucus and Augusta Taurinorum, or Turin, were doubtless potent influences in keeping him faithful to his allegiance. Farther north among the Graean Alps lay the Salaci, watched by a Roman colony at Eporidia. These were destroyed root and branch. In BC 25, Marcus Terentius Varro defeated them in battle, and the entire nation of 44,000 was sold into slavery in the marketplace of Eporidia, with the stipulation that the purchasers should remove them far from their native hills and not grant them their liberty for the space of 20 years. The severity of this punishment is perhaps incapable of justification, but it at least solved the problem of the protection of the military roads, which Augustus now built over the Little St. Bernard at Lugdunum, the capital of Gaul, and over the Great St. Bernard to the Lake of Geneva and the Rhine. 3,000 praetorians were settled at Augusta Praetoria, or Aosta, and a few years later the campaigns of Publius Silius against some of the lesser tribes completed the conquest of the whole region. A great trophy was erected at Segusio to commemorate this series of minor but useful campaigns, and the names of the 44 conquered nations were inscribed upon its arch. But Augustus was not satisfied with having gained possession of the southern slopes of the Alps. One conquest led on to another, and in BC 15 he commissioned his two stepsons, Tiberius and Drusus, to penetrate into Rhaetia and Vindelicia. The operations were most skillfully carried out. Drusus entered Rhaetia from the south, and advancing up the valley of the Adige, crossed the Brenner Pass and defeated the Rhaetians in what is now the Austrian Tyrol, while Tiberius, moving with a second army from Gaul, fell upon the Vindelici in their rear. In a naval battle on Lake Constance, the Roman triremes overwhelmed the barbarian flotillas, and the two imperial armies marched without mishap from victory to victory through some of the most difficult country in Europe. Horace, in one of his finest odes, celebrated the glories of Drusus's campaign with genuine enthusiasm and reflected the proud confidence of the Roman world that there was no military operation beyond the powers of the Claudian house. Nil Claudiae non perficient manus. The empire seemed safe, which was supported by two such imperial pillars, and by an emperor so discerning of genius in the younger branches of his family. Thus, for the first time, the northern slopes of the Alps became Roman territory, and Roman influence spread among the middle reaches of the Danube. In accordance with his usual practice, Augustus sought to break the power of the tribes by settling them in the valleys and by the foundation of military colonies, while the outpost of the empire at this period was fixed at Augusta Vindelicium, or Augsburg, a few miles south of the Danube. Apparently without the need of another campaign, the spacious district lying to the east of Rhaetia, with the Danube for its northern and Pannonia for its eastern boundary, became the province of Noricum. On the western side, the dangerous gap of open country lying between the Danube and the Rhine was protected by settlements of Gallic colonists, transplanted thither from beyond the Rhine, and the region was known as the Tithe Lands, or Agri Decumates. Yet much hard fighting lay before the Roman legions, and there were many hours of cruel anxiety in store for Augustus before the Danube, along its whole course, became the frontier of the empire. The province of Illyricum remained for many years an open sore. In the campaign of 35, Augustus had not advanced beyond the Save, and the wild Pannonian tribes had not been thoroughly crushed. Their marauding bands evaded the Roman legions and constantly poured down upon the Adriatic. In BC 13, the situation was sufficiently serious to call for the presence of Agrippa, and upon his death the disturbances broke out anew. Tiberius was dispatched thither at the head of a large army, and while his brother Drusus waged successful and aggressive war in North Germany, he conducted 3 campaigns in Pannonia from BC 12 to 10. The result was an advance from the Save to the Drave, and the headquarters were removed from Siscia to Potovio, or Pettau, while Carnutum on the Danube, close to the modern city of Vienna, became the station of the Norican legion. The great bend of the Danube does not seem to have been occupied, and its incorporation took place later. Simultaneously with the revolt of the Pannonians came the rising in Thrace, where the native pro-Roman party was expelled and the tribes penetrated into Macedonia. Happily, however, Lucius Piso, the governor of Pamphylia, who was sent to take command of the Roman troops, proved himself equal to the emergency. The invaders were driven back, and Augustus placed Rhoemetalces upon the throne of Thrace. From BC 9 to AD 6, we hear nothing of the movements of the legions on the Danubian frontier. Rhaetia, Noricum, Pannonia, Moesia, the whole chain of new border provinces from west to east, were outwardly peaceful, and the natives seemed to have resigned themselves to the Roman rule. But they were still to make one last desperate struggle for freedom, which taxed to the utmost the military strength of Rome. The rising was exceedingly well timed. In AD 6, Augustus, emboldened by the apparently complete subjection of North Germany, had commissioned Tiberius to invade the territory of Maroboduus, the king of the Marcomanni, who held what is now Bohemia. It was decided to employ not only the Rhenish legions, but the whole army of the Danube, inasmuch as the main invasion was to take place from the southern side. Tiberius, therefore, advanced to Carnuntum with 6 legions, denuding the garrison towns of troops as he marched north, and calling upon the native levies to join him. The levies collected, but instead of moving to Carnuntum, they raised the standard of revolt, and in an instant the whole of Pannonia and Dalmatia were ablaze. According to the Roman estimates, the insurgents mustered 200,000 infantry and 9,000 horsemen, who spread over the provinces, murdering every Roman who fell into their hands, and destroying in a few weeks the patient labor of many years. The situation was indeed critical. Tiberius, with his army, was absolutely cut off from his base. He was confronted by Maroboduus and the Marcomanni. His rear was threatened by the rebels, and, as though to crown the misfortunes of Rome, the Dacians burst across the Danube and overran the province of Moesia. Only the Dacian king, Rhodometalces, remained true to his alliance and helped to stem the raging torrent. Rome was in a fever of apprehension, similar to that which had prevailed in the days of Marius, when the Cimbri were pouring through the passes of Cisalpine Gaul. It was fully believed that the barbarians of Dalmatia were on their way to Italy, and there was hardly a single legion to intercept their march. The dangers of the policy, deliberately adopted by Augustus, of removing as far as possible from the seat of empire the great military commands, were now made manifest. Hurriedly, therefore, new levies were raised. The veterans were summoned to resume their armor, and not only freedmen but slaves, enfranchised by the state on their enrollment, were pressed into the legions. Augustus himself warned the Senate that unless they rose to the emergency, they might see within 10 days the barbarians at their gates, and Boulais declares that even the cool and collected emperor, familiar as he was with desperate crises, shared the panic which fell upon Italy. The peril was instant, and if Maroboduus had boldly advanced to attack Tiberius and had made common cause with the Pannonians and Dalmatians, the Roman arms might have suffered a grave disaster. But the good fortune of Rome came once again to her succor. Tiberius, fully realizing his desperate position, immediately opened negotiations with the enemy who faced him. His overtures were not repulsed. An accommodation was arrived at. The Marcomanni remained tranquil, and Tiberius was left free to employ his legions in quelling the revolt in his rear. Troops from the transmarine provinces were hastily dispatched to his assistance, while the new Italian levies, under the command of the young Germanicus, crossed the border and pressed back the insurgent bands. Tiberius seems to have marched down to Siccia on the Save, where he was within easy communication with Rome, and to have gathered into winter quarters a vast army of 15 legions and an equal number of auxiliaries, by whose help, during the following summer, he broke the back of the rebellion. 3 campaigns, however, were necessary before the task was completed, and the Pannonian leaders sued for peace and pardon. The progress of those campaigns need not be followed in detail, but Suetonius lays stress, in his life of Tiberius, on the enormous difficulties which the Roman general had to overcome, partly due to the character of the country, and partly to the problem of providing supplies to so large a force. He adds, too, the striking sentence: "Though Tiberius was constantly receiving messages of recall, he stuck to his work, fearing lest the enemy, still hovering round him in strength, should fall upon his army if he made a backward movement." So, too, Dion Cassius declares that Augustus suspected Tiberius of deliberately prolonging the war, in order that he might remain at the head of his powerful force. But whatever motives were uppermost in the mind of the emperor, and it may be pointed out that Tiberius himself in after years adopted a precisely similar attitude towards Germanicus. There is no doubt that Tiberius showed a true discernment of the necessities of the situation in teaching the insurgents a lesson which they never forgot. Half conquests were futile in dealing with the tribesmen of Dalmatia and Pannonia, and 3 years were well spent in bringing them to their knees. They submitted in detachments, but large numbers continued to wage guerrilla warfare long after all hope of national independence had vanished. The chieftain Bato was one of the last to yield, and on being brought into the presence of Tiberius and asked what had prompted him to revolt, he replied that Rome herself was responsible for the insurrection because she had sent wolves instead of shepherds to protect her sheep. Whether the tribute exacted by the emperor from these Danubian provinces had been excessive, or whether the imperial tax collectors had fleeced the natives, we cannot say. Similar excuses for revolt have often been put forward simply to cover an incurable objection to paying any taxes at all, however moderate, and we may more probably attribute this dangerous rebellion, the most dangerous, in the carefully weighed words of Suetonius, since the Punic Wars, to the fierce spirit of nationality which made a last gigantic effort to win back a lost independence. When Tiberius at length returned to Rome, the victories he had won were consolidated by Germanicus, and the new province of Pannonia became one of the chief recruiting grounds of the Roman auxiliary army. Rome, too, found an able soldier outside the imperial family in Gnaeus Lentulus, the governor of Moesia. He not only repulsed the Dacians, who had crossed the frozen Danube in its lower reaches, but himself led for the first time a Roman army into Dacian territory, signally defeated the Getae and Bastarnae, and carried back with him across the river 50,000 Dacian captives, whom he settled in Thrace. During the short remainder of Augustus's reign, there was peace on the Danube. But there was war on the Rhine. No sooner had Rome begun its rejoicings over the pacification of Pannonia than the dreadful tidings arrived from Germany that Quintilius Varus had suffered an overwhelming disaster, that the general was dead, and that his entire army of 3 legions, 3 regiments of auxiliaries, and 6 cohorts had been cut to pieces by the German barbarians. Let us then turn to the Gallic frontier and recount the circumstances which culminated in this staggering defeat and the wreck of many of Augustus's most cherished hopes. We have seen in a previous chapter how the emperor had made the Rhine the eastern frontier of Gaul. It seems probable, though on this point the authorities are silent, that during the early part of his reign, Augustus had no thought of penetrating far across the river into the territory of the Germans. His main object had been rather to secure the Gallic provinces from invasion than to extend his borders. But as time went on and his troops began to push north, still on the left bank, into the Netherlands, and as he found that he could not safely ignore what transpired upon the right bank of the river, he was insensibly drawn into adopting a forward Germanic policy. Then, as his proverbial good fortune continued to attend him, and his first ventures across the stream proved successful, it would appear that Augustus decided to advance his frontier, first from the Rhine to the Weser, and then from the Weser to the Elbe. By doing so, he would remove all pressure from Gaul, and he had fair grounds for hope that the signal triumph which had crowned his conciliatory policy towards the Gallic cantons would be repeated among the German tribes. This we believe to be the true explanation of the course which events took in the Rhineland. Having gone so far, Augustus found himself compelled to go still farther and annex in spite of himself. Again, the parallels of British annexations in India and Burma, and of the Russian advance in Central Asia, leap to mind. Conquering states are driven forward by their own momentum, quite as much as by carefully calculated reasons of policy, whenever they come in contact with less highly organized communities. It is also to be remembered that when great armies are collected in standing camps along a frontier, their commanding officers invariably chafe at inaction and impress upon the home government the feasibility of further advance. In the case of the armies of the Rhine, those commanders were princes of the imperial house, eager to show themselves worthy and capable in the old Roman way, the way of military conquest. And the emperor himself, cautious though he was, knew that a series of brilliant victories, gained by the younger members of his family, was at once the shortest road to popular favor and the most effective method of silencing criticism at home. It is at least significant that no great forward movement on a large scale took place upon the Rhine until BC 12, when the young Prince Drusus made his first dramatic campaign. This was not, of course, the first occasion on which Romans and Germans had faced one another in the field. Agrippa had crossed the Rhine as early as 38 BC in order to protect the friendly clan of the Ubii from the attacks of their kinsmen and to facilitate their transference to the left bank. In BC 25, a punitive expedition had been undertaken to avenge the massacre of some Roman merchants. 5 years later, the presence of Agrippa had again been required to expel an irruption of German tribes, and in 16 BC, the Sugambri, Usipetes, and Tencteri had crossed the river in force at various points and raided far and wide in the province of Belgica. They inflicted a humiliating defeat upon the 5th Legion, commanded by Marcus Lollius. Compared with the annihilation of the army of Varus 25 years later, this was justly described by Suetonius as majoris infamiae quam detrimenti, a blow to Rome's prestige rather than to her military strength, for it was speedily repaired by the presence of Augustus and Agrippa, who hurried to the scene with powerful reinforcements, only to find that the invaders retreated hastily before them without offering battle. But the unsoldierly behavior of the 5th Legion in the face of the enemy and the loss of its eagle made a painful impression upon public opinion, and it was to wipe out the memory of this military disgrace that Augustus sanctioned the aggressive campaign undertaken by Drusus in BC 12 after his victories in Rhaetia and Vindelicia. Such a campaign, however, was not undertaken for sentimental reasons alone. The Germans had once more assumed the offensive, united in a powerful confederacy consisting of the Sugambri, the Cherusci, and the leading Suebian tribes, with the exception of the Chatti. They again crossed the Rhine, so confident of victory that they had already agreed among themselves as to the division of the spoils. But Drusus was more than a match for the German chieftains. He drove the invaders back, ravaged the territory of the Sugambri and the Usipetes from Cologne to Nijmegen, and then, when the confederacy had dissolved under the stress of defeat, he proceeded to carry out his own plan of campaign. This was to establish the Roman arms along the North Sea coast to the mouths of the Weser and the Elbe by means of a joint naval and military expedition. Such a scheme must have been maturing for some years. From the fact that the Batavian tribes in the Rhine Delta offered no opposition, and that the Frisians actually assisted in the expedition, we may suppose that Drusus's emissaries had been busy amongst them, purchasing their support against their neighbors in accordance with the traditional policy of Julius, which had facilitated his conquest of Gaul. Still stronger evidence is found in the circumstance that Drusus had gathered a large flotilla of transports and that a canal had been dug from the Rhine to the Zuider Zee, or Lacus Flevis, to avoid as far as possible the perils of the open sea. The expedition proved successful. The fleet of the Bructeri was defeated in the river Ems, and Drusus reached in safety the mouth of the Weser. Then, while returning by the way it had come, his fleet ran aground on the Frisian coast, and but for the help of the natives, would have suffered disaster. By this campaign, Drusus gained new allies for Rome and a hold over the north coast. In the following year, BC 11, he began his great invasion of Germany proper. Again, the dissensions of the German tribes were of the greatest service to Rome. While Drusus had been absent in the North Sea, the Sugambri had invaded the adjoining territory of the Chatti. Seizing their chance, the legions stationed on the Rhine had moved into the vacant territory, and Drusus, on his return, marched triumphantly to the Weser without having to fight any important action. While returning to winter quarters with his main army, he came within an ace of destruction at Arbalo, the site of which defies identification. where only the overconfidence of the Germans saved him from annihilation. In the following year, BC 10, the Chatti were conquered. In BC 9, the Marcomanni withdrew into Bohemia, and the victorious Drusus continued his triumphal progress from the Weser to the Elbe, through the territory of the Cherusci. There the legions halted, but on their way back they suffered an irreparable loss in the death of their gallant and youthful commander. Drusus was thrown from his horse, and after suffering the agony of a broken thigh for 30 days, died, to the grief of his soldiers and of the whole Roman world. His elder brother Tiberius hastened north to take over the command, and during the next 2 years carried on with vigor the work which Drusus had begun. In 5 years, therefore, Rome had asserted her mastery over the vast expanse which was bounded by the Rhine, the North Sea, the Elbe, and the Saale, and the exploits of Julius in Gaul had been repeated in Germany. We may be tolerably certain that the emperor and his ministers believed that a vast new province had been added to the empire. They thought that the frontier had been permanently thrown forward to the Elbe, and that the next move of the legions would be to advance southward from the Saale into Bohemia until they reached the Danube on the bank opposite to the new Roman territory of Vindelicia. Warned by his experiences in Pannonia and Illyricum, Augustus was probably quite prepared for spasmodic insurrection, and the fact that no standing camp was established for the troops to the east of Aliso on the Ems shows that the emperor proceeded with caution. But the peace which reigned in Germany during the next few years must have been very flattering to his hopes. He transplanted the irreconcilable Sugambri across to the very seaboard of Gaul and settled among the Gallic cantons a number of the Suebian tribes. He thus removed all danger of German irruptions into Gaul, and by creating a pro-Roman party among the princely houses of the Cherusci, gradually extended his sway over the heart of Germany. The legions marched east every summer to put down the insurrection and disorder, returning every autumn to their winter quarters on the Ems and the Rhine. It seems as though the Romanization of Germany would involve no greater difficulties than had been successfully surmounted elsewhere. Tiberius had laid down the German command in BC 6. He resumed it in AD 4 on his reconciliation with Augustus and his restoration to favor. It was the post which needed the ablest general and administrator in the imperial service, and such Tiberius had proved himself to be. His campaigns of AD 5 and 6 were carried out in the country lying between the Weser and the Elbe, while the German fleet again navigated the North Sea, exploring the coast as far as the northern extremity of Jutland, and then sailing up the Elbe to cooperate with the land forces. Then, feeling sure that the subjugation of the north was completed, Tiberius prepared to attack the Marcomanni in their Bohemian fastnesses. Their king, Maroboduus, had copied to some extent the Roman military model, and had gathered together a fighting force of 70,000 infantry and 4,000 horsemen. With him were allied, more or less loosely, the tribes on the right bank of the Elbe, the Semnones and the Suevi, who now felt it would be their turn next to be attacked by the restless Romans. Hitherto Maroboduus had remained neutral in the long strife between Rome and the Germans. He now, in AD 6, found his territory threatened with invasion on 2 sides. Sentius Saturninus, with an army from Mogontiacum, or Mayence, up the valley of the Main, through what is now the northern part of Bavaria, while Tiberius, quitting Germany, had concentrated an army of 12 legions at Carnutum on the Danube, in order to enter Bohemia from the south. But as we have seen, it was at this moment that the whole of Pannonia and Illyricum rose in rebellion at the back of Tiberius, and Maroboduus consented to make peace, instead of prosecuting the war with tenfold vigor. History has not recorded the terms upon which he agreed to sheathe the sword, but we may fairly suppose that he received specific guarantees from Tiberius that his territory would not be invaded, and that the emperor pledged himself to respect the integrity of his dominions. Whether that pledge, if it were given, would have been kept when the hands of Augustus were again free is more than doubtful, but circumstances soon arose which compelled a revision of his whole frontier policy with respect to Germany. While Maroboduus continued to turn a deaf ear to the representations and entreaties of the German patriots, a new star was appearing in the north. Among the princes of the Cherusi was one named Arminius, who, upon the submission of his father, Sigimer, had frequented the Roman camps and seen service with the legions. He had been granted the Roman citizenship and the rank of an equus, and had carefully studied Roman tactics. Enjoying as he did the full confidence of the commander-in-chief in Germany, his loyalty was held to be above suspicion, in spite of the information frequently laid against him by his personal enemy Segestes. Yet it is important to point out that the rebellion which he fomented was in no sense a national rising of the whole of Germany. Even when Arminius threw off all disguise, Maroboduus never stirred, while the Batavi, Frisia, Chauci, and the other tribes of the north hardly made a sign. The revolt was strictly local in character, and its marvelous success was due rather to the appalling incapacity of a Roman general than to the genius of Arminius, or to the numbers which he placed in the field. The tragic story which remains to be told irresistibly reminds the English reader, in certain of its leading features, of the tale of the Indian Mutiny. Quintilius Varus, the Gallic commander-in-chief, was utterly unfitted for high command. He had owed his promotion directly to court favor and to his marriage with the niece of the emperor, while he had grown rich on the plunder of Syria. Nor did he possess a single soldierly quality. He was a sluggard in mind as in body, and better suited, in the scathing phrase of Boulais, for the repose of camps than for the hardships of a campaign. His political insight was as faulty as his generalship. Varus believed that the national spirit of the Germans around him had been broken. He refused to listen to the reports of his intelligence officers. He trusted Arminius as implicitly as the British colonels trusted their sepoys. Lulled into a false sense of security, he closed his eyes to the evidences of treason which were laid before him. Frequentissime initium calamitatis securitas. In that phrase we have the adequate explanation of the success of Arminius. Varus thought that the Germans were sufficiently tamed to endure the introduction of Roman methods and customs, and acted as though he were an urban praetor presiding over the law courts in the forum, rather than a general in the heart of an enemy's country. Such was the man to whom the supreme command of the Rhine legions had been entrusted, and in year 9 the crisis came. Varus was then in his summer quarters on the Weser, in the neighborhood of the modern Minden. His communications with the Rhine were kept open by a chain of small posts along the road which ran through Aliso to Vetera, the headquarters of the Northern Army on the Rhine. He spent the summer in hearing lawsuits and adjusting quarrels, and then in the autumn prepared to lead his army back. In order to punish some refractory districts, he decided to take a circuitous route which led him away from the main road, and set out with an army of about 20,000 men, encumbered with baggage and hampered by the presence of a large number of women and children. He was not anticipating serious opposition, but was merely marching from summer to winter quarters, a circumstance which helps to explain, though it does not in the remotest degree justify, his utter unpreparedness for attack. No sooner had he reached difficult country than the people rose in insurrection all around him. Arminius himself accompanied the general and supped in his tent, and on the very evening before he quitted the Roman lines, his rival, Segestes, had denounced his intended treason to Varus and had implored him to seize them both and hold them as hostages until his warning should be verified by fact. Varus refused to believe and blundered on, nor was it until Arminius had absented himself and then speedily reappeared at the head of an army host, attacking the Roman column, that the general recognized the trap into which he had fallen. Even then the army need not have been lost if there had been a capable general in command of the legions. Roman troops had often found themselves in equally ugly corners, but had shaken off their adversaries and extricated themselves from peril. Their communications were cut. They were surrounded by forests and swamps. They had to fight for every forward step they took, and they were cruelly hampered by the severity of the weather and the encumbrances of the women and the wounded. Yet though their plight was bad, it was no worse than that from which Julius Caesar, Marcus Antonius, and the younger Drusus had emerged in triumph. But not only was Varus himself absolutely incompetent, but his staff officers apparently were equally destitute of military science, leadership, and even courage. The cavalry were led from the field of battle by their craven commander in disgraceful flight, only to be surrounded and cut to pieces a few miles farther on. The infantry stood their ground manfully until Varus, who was wounded early in the battle, took his own life. From the fact that his friends tried to burn the body to prevent it from falling into the enemy's hands, we may infer that the army of Varus was not rushed in one great onslaught, but rather that the attack was renewed on successive days, and that the legions were overwhelmed piecemeal as the march gradually became a rout. Despairing of safety, most of the officers imitated the example of Varus and committed suicide, until at length the sole survivor surrendered what remained of the army to Arminius. Such was the fate of Varus and his legions, and such the heavy penalty paid by arrogance and incompetence. The whole host perished miserably. Only a few stragglers managed to reach Aliso in safety, while most of those who had surrendered were barbarously put to death by their captors. Some were crucified, others were burned alive, others were offered as sacrifice on the altars of the German priests, and their heads were nailed to the trees of the forest. And it is significant that the victors reserved their most appalling tortures not for the combatants, but for the advocates and pleaders whom they found in Varus's camp. Florus preserves the legend that when one of these luckless lawyers had his tongue cut out and his mouth sewn up, his savage executioners taunted him with the jibe, "At last, you viper, cease your hissing." The story has its historical importance as showing how deeply the iron of the Roman law had entered into the soul of the free German barbarian. Some historians have sought to explain the defeat of Varus and the indifferent behavior of his troops by the supposition that these 3 legions were composed mainly of recruits, and that the Rhine had been denuded of its veterans to reinforce the Danubian legions in Pannonia and Illyricum. But in the face of the explicit statement of Boulais, who describes the legions of Varus as the flower of the Roman army, this supposition is scarcely tenable. Helpless incompetence, such as that displayed by Varus and his staff, has led to the destruction of even finer armies than that which perished so miserably in one of the defiles of the mountain ranges of Münster, and left its 3 eagles in the possession of the exultant Germans. It was fortunate indeed for Rome that even in the moment of depression attending this shattering defeat, there were found 1 or 2 capable men on the spot who knew how to avert the full consequences of the disaster. One of these, Lucius Caedicius, was stationed at Aliso. When the Germans, flushed with their triumph, advanced to overwhelm him, he resolutely bore the siege as long as his supplies held out, and then quitting his encampment under cover of night, succeeded in fighting his way through Vetera on the Rhine. Thanks to Caedicius, who thus delayed the rush of Arminius, Lucius Manius Asprenas, in command of 2 legions at Mogontiacum, or Mayence, had time to move north to Vetera to secure the passage of the river, and to allay the excitement among the German tribes and Gallic cantons on the left bank. Arminius did not even essay to cross the Rhine, and the worst fears which were entertained at Rome were not realized. It was fortunate again for Augustus that the king of the Marcomanni still remained faithful to his neutrality. Arminius sent him the head of Varus as a ghastly proof of victory and as an incitement to him to join in the national movement, but Maroboduus merely forwarded the head to Augustus and kept his faith with Rome. No wonder the Romans made Fortune a goddess and worshipped her at her shrine. Rome had been prepared to celebrate with unusual magnificence the victories of Tiberius and Germanicus in Illyricum when the calamitous news arrived. At once panic and despair seized upon the capital. The festivals were abandoned, the games were forgotten, and alike in the palace, in the Senate, and in the Forum, all trembled with fear lest the next courier should bring word that the whole of Gaul was ablaze. Tiberius, fortunately present in Rome at this critical hour, was sent to take over the command on the Rhine for the third time, with every available soldier who could be spared for the purpose. But now the aged emperor completely broke down under the blow. In a graphic and familiar chapter, Suetonius describes how Augustus, for long months together, neglected the care of his person and allowed his hair and beard to go untrimmed, how he dashed his head in frenzy against the walls and was constantly heard to cry out in anguish, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions!" Whether these details be simple truth or decorated fable, we can well believe what a shock such a disaster must have been to one of Augustus's years, and to an emperor who had been accustomed to tidings of victory. So grave was the position that he not only posted guards throughout the city to repress any possible tumult, but sent dispatches to the provincial governors, bidding them be specially watchful of rebellion. When military empires lose their military prestige, insurrection is the natural result. His first care was to obtain new recruits for his army, but the people hung back and would not enlist. According to Dion Cassius, he branded with infamy and confiscated the goods of 1 man in every 5 under 35 years of age who refused to serve, and of 1 man in 10 of all above that age. But even these rigorous measures were unavailing to procure the necessary recruits, and he was driven to put many to death before reinforcements could be raised and sent north to Tiberias. The emperor banished all Gauls and Germans from the capital and dismissed the German mercenaries serving in the Praetorian Guard. So apprehensive was he that there was treason afoot. Nor was his confidence restored until he was assured of the unwavering loyalty of Maroboduus and received the gratifying intelligence that the victorious enemy had turned back. Throughout the closing years of his reign, no decisive actions were fought. During the year 10, Tiberius held the supreme command. In the ensuing year, he shared it with Germanicus. In the year 12, he was again sole commander, while at the beginning of 13, he returned to Rome and left Germanicus behind him as commander-in-chief. Their expeditions were intended not so much to reconquer Germany as to make an imposing demonstration of military strength, and in the meantime, Augustus had arrived at the momentous decision to abandon the Elbe frontier and fall back upon the Rhine. It was not too much to say that this was one of the most important steps which he took throughout his whole reign, and one which had the most far-reaching consequences. No one can estimate how profoundly he thereby modified the course of future events, or to what extent the history of modern Europe would have been changed if he had not definitely abandoned his old policy of Romanizing Germany as he had Romanized Gaul and Spain. The development of Teutonic civilization would, in all human probability, have proceeded along wholly different lines, and there would not have been that sharp antagonism between the Latin and the Teuton temperament which has been and still is one of the most dominating factors in European politics. It remains to ask why Augustus took this retrograde step, and to judge whether his policy was prudent or the reverse. His motives, at least, were clear enough. Augustus was an old man, and his chief anxiety was that he might end his days in peace. He had acutely felt the long strain of the Pannonian and Dalmatian wars, and he regarded with even graver apprehension the prospect of equally arduous and hazardous campaigns in Germany. It was abundantly clear that the reconquest of Germany must involve sooner or later a great war with the Marcomanni, with the moral certainty that in Bohemia, too, there would be a long period of revolt and insurrection, as well as trouble with the tribes living beyond the Elbe. The retention of the Elbe frontier meant, in other words, a continued war policy and a continued series of annexations, for barbarism and the Roman civilization could not lie peacefully side by side. Such a policy, to be successful, would inevitably entail an enormous increase in the military forces of the empire, and Augustus had just seen how strong was the disinclination of the people of Italy to enter the legions even in a moment of desperate emergency. The fact that not only freedmen but slaves were drafted by hundreds into the legions raised in the recent crises, spoke eloquently of the decay of the ancient martial spirit. We cannot wonder, therefore, that he hesitated and drew back, impelled thereto alike by his personal inclinations, by his increasing infirmities, by the loss of popularity which, with rare exceptions, seemed to be one of the penalties of length of reign, as well as by his certain conviction that the legions were barely adequate to hold even the territory which was already securely Roman. The far-flung battle line of Rome was dangerously thin. Who should know the peril of its further extension better than Augustus? The tendency of the latest school of historians is to condemn the step which the emperor took. They point out with perfect truth that a boundary formed by the Elbe and the Danube is far shorter than a boundary formed by the Rhine and the Danube. From the strategic point of view, there can be no comparison between them. All the advantages lie with the Elbe over the Rhine. The essential weakness of the Rhine and Danube frontier was that the legions stationed on the two rivers could not cooperate or lend one another assistance, for a great wedge of barbarism was thrust in between them, which proved an impassable barrier. But statesmanship has to deal with the actual rather than with the ideal, and has usually to be content with the second best. Augustus drew back. One would give much to know the contents of the dispatches which passed between him and Tiberius. No doubt he left Tiberius considerable freedom of action, but the general tenor of his instructions was clearly back. Probably enough, Augustus never made an explicit or public announcement of his determination. Public opinion was opposed to retirement, and there was doubtless critics in plenty who denounced Augustus in secret for his policy of scuttle. The subsequent campaigns of Germanicus in the early years of Tiberius's reign show how keen the legions were to be led against the conquerors of Varus, and the recall of Germanicus after a series of brilliant victories gave rise to the most malignant rumors. The abandonment of Germany was felt to be a confession of weakness, to be a retraction of the proud boast of Rome that wherever her standards had once been planted, they made the soil around them Roman. It was a foretaste of humiliation, an acknowledgment of defeat, which could not be concealed by the formation of the two so-called Germanic provinces on the Rhine, carved not out of the territory of the German but of the Gaul. Yet Augustus was right to draw back if he considered his military strength inadequate to the task of holding down all Germany. At the moment it certainly was inadequate, and the miserable exhibition of craven cowardice, which had just been made by the Roman people, fully justified him in the step which he took. But was he equally justified in solemnly warning his successors to be content with the boundaries as he left them? We think not. He should rather have urged upon them the imperative need of increasing and reorganizing the Roman army so that it might carry the eagles once more to the Elbe and guard that frontier as the Rhine was already guarded. He himself might be too old to recreate Roman military ardor, but he should have set this duty before those who were to come after him. As it was, the injunction which he laid upon Tiberius in his will, the injunction that the empire should be confined to its present limits, became the keystone of Roman policy with respect to Germany, and Tiberius allowed Germanicus to wage campaign after campaign in Germany as though his policy were reconquest, and then withdrew him at the very moment when the prizes of victory seemed to be falling into his hands. Thus the Rhine continued to be the Roman frontier as long as the empire lasted. New provinces were formed in later years in Britain, Dacia, and Mesopotamia, but Germany was left to the barbarian. Augustus sought, as we have said, to conceal his complete change of policy by permitting Tiberius and Germanicus to make military demonstrations on the right bank of the Rhine. He also raised the number of the Rhenish legions from 5 to 8, and settled the formation of the two provinces of Upper and Lower Germany. The former, with its headquarters at Mogontiacum, or Mayence, stretched from above Koblenz to below Argentoratum, or Strasbourg, and included not only the right bank of the Rhine, but also the valleys of the Main and the Neckar. Lower Germany stretched from below Bonn to the North Sea, keeping to the left bank of the Rhine until Noviomagus, or Nijmegen, was reached, and then striking across to the Zuider Zee, and including the whole of the Netherlands. Vetera, where the river Leppe flows into the Rhine, was the capital of this province, and a chain of 50 forts secured the principal points of passage along the river bank up to its source. On the left dwelt the tribes which had been transplanted from the right by successive generals, and these were retained by Augustus and his successors as a rampart against their kinsmen for the protection of Gaul. But the dream of a great German province faded forever from the view of Rome. End of section 19. Section 20 of Augustus Caesar and the Organization of the Empire of Rome by John B. Firth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. The Imperial Family. The fortunes of the imperial family during the last 20 years of Augustus's life are of absorbing interest. The death of Marcus Agrippa in BC 12 had again left the question of the succession open. Augustus, indeed, had formally adopted Agrippa's 2 eldest sons, Caius and Lucius Caesar, but Caius was a mere child of 8, and the care of the Roman Empire could not devolve upon a boy. Agrippa also had 2 daughters, Julia and Agrippina, and a 3rd son, subsequently known as Agrippa Postumus, was born a few months later. Augustus had thus 5 grandchildren in the direct line, but he needed an heir who might, in case of his sudden demise, succeed at once. The death of Agrippa, therefore, enhanced the already brilliant prospects of the 2 sons of Livia, Tiberius and Drusus. The elder, Tiberius, had been a quaestor and praetor, and had accompanied the emperor into Gaul. He was married to Vipsania, the daughter of Agrippa by his first wife, Pomponia, and to her he was devotedly attached. Augustus now commanded him to divorce her and marry the widow Julia, who was thus for the 3rd time forced into a matrimonial alliance for reasons of state. Tiberius unwillingly complied, with great anguish of mind, says Suetonius, because he loved Vipsania and disapproved of the character of Julia, and for the next few years he and his brother Drusus stood next the throne. They had already displayed their military capacity by adding Rhaetia, Vindelicia, and Noricum to the empire, and Drusus in Germany and Tiberius in Pannonia continued to win new laurels for themselves and for Augustus. Drusus was perhaps the more popular of the 2, for even in his early manhood there was noted in Tiberius that quality of moroseness which grew upon him in later life. Yet in capacity they were both adequate to any command which might be entrusted to them, and the loss of Marcus Agrippa, the most capable man of his time, was scarcely felt, thanks to the genius displayed by the 2 crown princes. But in BC 9, Drusus succumbed to the effects of a fall from his horse in Germany at the age of 30, leaving behind him, as a child of but 12 months, the young Germanicus. His brother Tiberius hurried up to Germany to take over the vacant command, enjoyed in BC 7 the honor of a triumph, and in the following year received the tribunicia potestas for 5 years. This, as we have seen in the case of Agrippa, was the highest distinction which Augustus could bestow, yet no sooner was it granted than Tiberius withdrew from public life. He had, indeed, good reasons to be dissatisfied with a position which must have been intensely galling to one who inherited a full measure of the Claudian pride. He detested the wife who had been thrust upon him. Suetonius narrates how, some time after his marriage with Julia, he happened to encounter Vipsania and gazed after her with tears in his eyes, and how Augustus took precautions that they might never meet again. Naturally, therefore, Tiberius's relations with Julia were none of the happiest, and after she had borne him a child who died in infancy, they ceased to live together. From this time forward, Julia cast discretion to the winds, and the irregularities of her conduct were the common talk and scandal of Rome. They were known to everyone except her father, to whom she was still the apple of his eye. Augustus was intensely proud of her beauty and of her winning, fascinating ways. He had bestowed unusual pains over her education, and Julia possessed, in addition to remarkable natural wit, all the accomplishments of the day. She had been brought up on the stern ancient model under the care of the Empress Livia, and it was well known in Rome how the consort and the daughter of Augustus wove in their own apartments the woolen garments worn by the emperor. Augustus had hoped that Julia would develop into a Roman matron, distinguished for her gravity and reserve, and emulating in domestic virtues the patterns of Roman perfection. Save for dynastic reasons, nothing would have pleased him better than for Julia to become a Vestal Virgin, dedicating her life to the religious service of the state. But this accomplished and high-spirited girl chafed at the restrictions imposed upon her. Many anecdotes are recorded which show how entirely her views were opposed to those of her father. "My father forgets that he is Caesar," she replied to one who reminded her that Augustus's ideal was simplicity. "I cannot but remember that I am Caesar's daughter." On another occasion, when she presented herself in the emperor's presence in a rich and elaborate costume, he said nothing, but the look on his face showed his displeasure. The following day, she appeared in a somber and simple dress, and he at once exclaimed that now she was attired as befitted Caesar's daughter. "Today," was her answer, "I am dressed to please my father. Yesterday I dressed to please my husband." At another time, he sternly rebuked a young Roman noble named Lucius Vicinius for calling upon his daughter at Baiae, and chided Julia for appearing in the theatre in the company of some of the young fashionables of Roman society. "They will grow old with me," was her pert reply. But though her conduct vexed him sometimes and led him to exclaim that he had two troublesome daughters, Julia and the Republic, he still had a profound belief in her purity and innocence, and was heard to boast that she was a second Claudia, the equal in virtue of the famous Roman matron, whose chastity had availed to draw off the vessel conveying the image of Cybele from the shallows of the Tiber upon which it had grounded. Augustus was cruelly deceived. Julia was indeed a second Claudia, but her prototype was not Claudia the virtuous, but Clodia of Catullus, the notorious Medea of the Palatine, whose amours and excesses were still vividly remembered. It is impossible not to feel some sympathy with a high-spirited girl who had been brought up in such uncongenial surroundings, in the society of a stepmother who saw in her the chief obstacle to her ambitious hopes for her own son, and of a father who did not carry into practice the stern morality which he inculcated into his women folk. Augustus's love for Julia was sincere and profound, but he had not hesitated to marry her, not once, but thrice, for reasons of state. Her union with the young and handsome Marcellus may not have been uncongenial, but Marcus Agrippa was of the same age as her father, and too deeply immersed in his public duties to care much for pleasure. There was no open scandal before Agrippa's death, but when, on his demise, she found herself thrust upon the reluctant Tiberius, there is little wonder that she turned to the gay world for amusement and frivolity. The position was an almost intolerable one, both for husband and wife, and Julia flung herself headlong into the whirlpool's shrieking face. She counted her lovers by the score. Their names have come down to us, and we find among them a Gracchus, a Scipio, an Appius Claudius, even an Antonius. Tiberius dared not lay the truth before Augustus. He did not venture to disclose to the father the adulteries of the daughter, and thus the associate of Augustus in the tribunician power, and the second man in the empire, had to suffer in silence the stain which his wife inflicted upon his honor. Here, no doubt, we may find at least one of the motives which determined Tiberius to retire from Rome. Yet this was not his only reason. The two eldest sons of his wife, Caius and Lucius Caesar, were growing up to manhood, and Augustus lavished upon them the affection of a grandfather. They were always in his company. At his meals, he liked to have them lying at the foot of his couch, Whenever he drove out, he took them with him in his carriage, or had them riding on horseback by his side. He taught them himself, and took pains that they should model their handwriting upon his own. He bestowed upon them the title of Princes of the Youth, and looked eagerly forward to introducing them into public life. The eagerness was so manifest that the Senate passed special decrees to enable them to hold office at an exceptionally early age, and Caius, while still in his teens, was already admitted to the priesthood and the senatorial benches at public banquets and the shows. Tiberius, the general and administrator, the capable man of action and statesman, might possess the esteem and the respect of Augustus, but the emperor's affections were centered in the two young princes, and Tiberius probably saw that, in the course of the next few years, he would be shelved to make way for the youthful favorites. He knew that he had been forced to marry their mother, that he might act as guardian of her sons, and Julia not only disdained him as unequal in rank to herself, though a Claudius acknowledged no superior in point of rank and birth, but made his dishonor and her own the byword of the capital. Tiberius, therefore, in B.C. 6, declined the commission given him by Augustus to settle the affairs of Armenia, and announced his intention of retiring to Rhodes. He urged as his excuse that his ambition had been satisfied and that his one desire was for rest and retirement. Livia implored him not to go. Augustus bitterly complained in the Senate that he was being deserted by his family. Tiberius was obdurate and abstained from food for 4 days until the requisite permission was granted. Then he hurriedly quitted Rome and betook himself to Rhodes, where he remained in exile for 8 years, living in a modest house as a private citizen and on terms of equality with his Greek acquaintances. The withdrawal of Tiberius left the field open to the two young princes. In B.C. 5, Augustus accepted the consulship in order to introduce Caius Caesar to public life, and accepted it again in B.C. 2 for the introduction of Lucius. But in the latter year, the storm which had been gathering over the head of Julia broke in full fury. Augustus at last heard the truth which had probably been known for years to everyone but himself. Grown reckless from long impunity, Julia had openly flaunted her folly in the forum and paraded her vices in the public streets. The daughter of the emperor, now in her 38th year, was not content with being the leader of the gay and dissolute fashionable society, of which Ovid was the mouthpiece and instructor in vice, but she had fallen, if her accusers may be believed, to the level of the common women of the town. Augustus, in his fierce anger, spared neither himself nor the guilty ones. He made no effort at concealment. He called the Senate and the whole world to witness how a Roman father could punish the crimes of a dearly loved child. Julia was banished to the barren island of Pandataria, where no one was allowed to approach her without permission. He forbade her the use of wine and all the delicacies and comforts of life. Most of her paramours suffered a like sentence of banishment. One alone was put to death. This was Julius Antonius, the son of the triumvir, who had been spared and brought up by Augustus in the palace, and had been mad enough to intrigue with the daughter of the man who had slain his father. Augustus felt the disgrace deeply. When he was told that one of Julia's freedwomen, named Phoebe, who had been privy to her mistress's amours, had hanged herself, the bitter cry escaped him, "I would that I had been Phoebe's father rather than Julia's." It was not only the honor of the imperial house which suffered, but the credit of the imperial policy. He had been struggling for years against the corruption of the age. The disgrace of his own daughter now advertised the impotence of his efforts. Horace had congratulated the emperor on his success in restoring domestic purity. Nullis polluitor casta domus stupris, mos et lex maculosum edomuit nefas. Here was the damning commentary. Augustus had to admit defeat, and his daughter had struck the blow. It is this which explains the severity with which he treated the guilty Julia. He was not a moral man himself, but he had preached morality to others. Had he acted up to his own professions, he might have taught better and learnt how to forgive. Rome sympathized with the daughter, not with the father. The people constantly petitioned him to relent and revoke the decree of banishment, but he was obdurate, and solemnly and in public cursed all such wives and daughters. The only concession he made was to allow Julia to change the prison from an island to the mainland, and to grant her an increase of personal comforts. But to the day of his death he never saw her again, and whenever her name, or that of her daughter Julia, who followed in her mother's footsteps, was mentioned, he would quote the line from Homer, "Ah, would that I had never entered wedlock, and had died a childless man!" The disgrace of Julia made no immediate change in the position of Tiberius. Augustus, indeed, had upon his own authority sent her, in the name of his stepson, a formal notice of repudiation, and the ill-starred marriage was thus dissolved. Tiberius rejoiced at his release, thought it politic to write frequent letters to Augustus, begging him to deal leniently with the culprit, and he now began to be anxious about his own situation, and to regret the hasty step which he had taken in retiring to Rhodes. But he found Augustus in no yielding mood. He was curtly informed, when he wrote asking to be allowed to return to Rome to see his family, that as he had been so eager to abandon them, he might dismiss from his mind all anxiety on their account. The emperor had been deeply angered at Tiberius's desertion of him, and the utmost concession which Livia could obtain from her husband was his consent to announce that Tiberius was acting as his legate in Rhodes. This, however, can scarcely have concealed from the prying eyes of Roman society the fact that Tiberius was in deep disgrace, and the world now looked at Caius and Lucius as the emperor's heirs. The elder of the two was sent at the head of an important mission to the east, under the tutelage of Lollius, and the public was given to understand that vast campaigns were in preparation, which should rival the conquests of Alexander. Caius was then 20 years of age, and when he reached Samos, Tiberius crossed over from Rhodes and paid a visit to his young kinsman. We do not know what took place at the interview, but it is evident that Tiberius endeavored to persuade Augustus that he had withdrawn to Rhodes in order that he might not stand in the way of Caius's advancement, and that he sought vainly to conciliate the favor of the youth who seemed certain of the succession. A story was current that Augustus had promised Caius that he would not allow Tiberius to return to Rome except with his consent, and Lollius, who was Caius's guardian and tutor, was a bitter enemy of Tiberius. Tiberius, therefore, not only failed to win Caius's goodwill, but his prestige fell so low that one of Caius's associates, heated with wine at his table, jumped up and swore that he would go to Rhodes and bring back the exile's head, if only Caius gave the word. Clearly throughout this period, Tiberius was regarded in the East as a man whose death would not be unwelcome in the highest quarters, and for 2 years he went in fear of his life. But suddenly there came a change in his fortunes, which was attributed to the ceaseless intercession of his mother Livia on his behalf, and to the disgrace of Lollius. The latter was discovered to have been in treasonable communication with the Parthians, and the young Caius had grown tired of the ascendancy which his guardian and adviser had exercised over him. His hatred of Lollius led him to become reconciled with Tiberius, and Caius seems to have urged the emperor to permit his stepfather's return to Rome. Consequently, in 2 AD, the exile of Rhodes was granted permission to return to the capital, on condition that he remain a private citizen and took no part in public life. Tiberius was now in his 45th, and Augustus in his 65th year, and the prospects of the former succeeding to the empire seemed remote indeed, inasmuch as Caius and Lucius Caesar were grown to manhood. Yet within 18 months of Tiberius's return, both were dead. Lucius Caesar, the consul elect, who had been sent on a mission to Spain, was seized with illness at Massalia and died there. In the following year, Caius was treacherously wounded in Armenia. The wound was not in itself a fatal one, but the young prince, whose constitution was not of the strongest, made slow recovery, and ruined his chance of restoration to health by omitting the proper medical precautions and indulging in excess. He withdrew to Syria and was on his way home, when he succumbed in the city of Limera. This double bereavement weighed heavily upon the now aging emperor. There is a charming letter addressed by him to Caius on the occasion of his own 66th birthday, in which he assures him how keenly he feels his absence. Oculi mei requerent meum Caium. My eyes sadly miss the presence of my dear Caius, especially on fete days like today, but wherever you are, I hope that you are well and happy and have celebrated my birthday. Augustus had made no secret of his intentions towards Caius, who was to have been his heir and successor. Now both he and his brother were dead, and public gossip in Rome did not hesitate to hint at poison and connect Livia and Tiberius with deaths so sudden and so opportune to their interests. There was, of course, not a jot of evidence to warrant the suspicion, and it may be dismissed without comment. The poisoner had not yet come to court. Thus, by a series of extraordinary fatalities, in which a superstitious world saw the manifest hand of destiny, the imperial family had been sadly thinned in numbers. It was certainly remarkable that the valetudinarian emperor should have survived so many of the younger scions of his house. Marcellus, Drusus, Caius, and Lucius Caesar, all four had been cut off in early manhood, while Agrippa had died in the full vigor of middle age. The dearest hopes of the emperor had been blasted by these unlooked-for calamities, and the disgrace of Julia still embittered his life. He had, indeed, still descendants in the direct line. Agrippa Posthumus was now a boy of 15. Julia, his eldest granddaughter, was married to Lucius Aemilius Paulus, and her sister Agrippina to Germanicus, the son of Drusus. But though these unions gave promise of a new generation, Augustus was well advanced in years and needed a prop upon which he might lean. It was natural, therefore, that he should turn again to Tiberius and restore him to favor. No sooner did the emperor receive the melancholy intelligence of the death of Caius than he adopted his stepson Tiberius and bestowed upon him the tribunicia potestas for a second time, together with the command of the Rhine legions for the prosecution of the war in Germany. But faithful as ever in his devotion towards his lineal descendants, he adopted at the same time his sole surviving grandson, Agrippa Posthumus, and insisted that Tiberius should adopt his nephew Germanicus, the son of his dead brother Drusus and the husband of Agrippina. By so doing, the emperor hoped to unite the imperial family and remove all causes of jealousy. The remainder of his reign was passed in almost unbroken warfare. During the next 5 years, from AD 4 to AD 9, Tiberius scarcely set foot in the capital. He was continuously with the legions, first in Germany, then in Pannonia, and afterwards back again on the Rhine, and only saw Augustus as he visited Rome to pass from one command to the other and receive his chief's instructions. The years were dark and gloomy, for the Pax Romana had been broken, and Rome was fighting on the Rhine and the Danube, not so much for glory as for existence. It was fortunate for Augustus that in this time of trial he had so experienced and capable a general as Tiberius on whom to rely, and that the genius of the Claudian house manifested itself once more in the young Germanicus, the worthy son of a worthy father. But the domestic troubles of Augustus had not yet come to an end. In AD 7, 3 years after his adoption, Posthumus was banished to the island of Planasia and kept under strict military guard. His offense is unknown, and his unhappy fate forms one of the dark mysteries of the house of Caesar. All the authorities agree that in character he was intractable and wild. Suetonius described him as brutish and fierce. Sordidum ac ferox ingenium. Boulais speaks of his extraordinary depravity of mind and his recklessness. Mire praevitate animi, atque ingenii in praecipitatia conversus. Tacitus, whose detestation of Tiberius would naturally bias him in favor of one of Tiberius's victims, declares that he was utterly devoid of worthy qualities and possessed only the brute courage of physical strength. Rudem sane bonarum artium et robore corporis stolide ferocem. We may suppose, therefore, that the young prince, whose personal appearance was ungainly and repellent, was a savage in manners, moody and vicious, and a stolid rebel against authority. His tastes were low, his mind depraved and gross, and he lacked the dignity which was part of the Roman noble's birthright. Probably in his childhood he had been neglected and allowed to run wild. His chances of the succession seemed hardly worth consideration, and it is to be remembered that he was brought up in the household of Julia at a time when his mother was scandalizing the capital. The account which Dion Cassius gives of how this luckless prince idled away his time at Baiae, fishing rod in hand, and claimed the attributes of Neptune and the command of the sea on the strength of the good fortune which attended his angling, suggests a dull wit and sluggish intellect, and it may well be that Agrippa Posthumus inherited that taint of madness which was to show itself in diverse yet unmistakable forms in the younger descendants of the Caesars. Augustus apparently attributed these defects of mind and character to willful perversity rather than to natural shortcomings. He soon grew impatient with his adopted son, and impatience turned to detestation. Posthumus had no friends at court, but he had many bitter enemies, and none more persevering and irreconcilable than the astute Livia, whose ascendancy over her husband grew stronger with his increasing infirmities, and whose ambitions were centered on one object alone, the advancement of her son Tiberius. Posthumus returned her hate in equal measure, accused her to his associates of all manner of crimes, and in his passion did not spare the emperor himself. The only living grandson of Augustus, he was jealous that his stepfather Tiberius should rob him of the whole or part of his inheritance, and the mad boy vowed vengeance. His unguarded language was carried to the emperor's ears, and Augustus determined to cast him off. He denounced Posthumus in the Senate, where he complained bitterly of the lad's character and vices, and the senators formally sanctioned the sentence of exile which had been passed upon him. Agrippa Posthumus, therefore, was deported to the island of Planasia and kept under strict watch. He found some sympathizers, for mention is made by Suetonius of an obscure conspiracy formed with the avowed object of rescuing him and his mother from their captivity. But the plotters were men of no account, a convicted embezzler named Lucius Audacius, and a Parthian half-breed, Asinius Epicetus. Such a crazy scheme had no chance of success and scarcely merits the name of conspiracy. Much more interesting is the story mentioned by Tacitus that Augustus, shortly before his death, repented of the harshness with which he had treated his grandson and paid him a secret visit in his prison. It was reported that he was accompanied only by Fabius Maximus and a few trusted servants, and that many tears were shed on both sides at the interview. It was said, too, that Maximus revealed the visit to his wife Marcia, who communicated it to the Empress Livia, and soon afterwards Maximus committed suicide, and Marcia blamed herself as the cause of his death. Probably the story was the merest gossip, but it is quite conceivable that the aged emperor, softening under the shadow of approaching death, repented him of the harshness with which he had treated a dull-witted lad, who probably had been more sinned against than sinning. The eager haste with which Livia and Tiberius hurried Agrippa Posthumus out of the world, as soon as Augustus had breathed his last, shows their anxiety to rid themselves of one who had been their victim and might even now become a dangerous rival. Agrippa Posthumus had been banished in AD 7. 2 years later, his sister Julia suffered the same fate. She had been married to Lucius Aemilius Paulus, one of the leading members of the Roman aristocracy, and bore him a son and daughter. But undeterred by the punishment which had overtaken her mother, she had followed the elder Julia's evil example, and the irregularities of her conduct were as notorious as those of her parent. Her lovers were many, but chief among them was Decimus Silanus, and the guilty pair were charged not only with adultery, but with treason. We do not know what form the treason took, but in some way or other the crime of Julia and Silanus appears to be closely connected with the banishment of Ovid, which took place at the same time. The nominal reason assigned for the sentence passed upon the poet was the verses which he had written on the art of love were an offense against public morality. Such a judgment would be endorsed by any censor of public morals, but this notorious poem had been published some years before, in the year indeed which had witnessed the banishment of the elder Julia, and the elegiacs of repentance which Ovid penned in his exile clearly indicate that this was not his principal offense. Many theories have been started in explanation of the obscure lines in which he refers to the reason which brought down upon him the wrath of the emperor, but the most plausible seems to be that which attributes to him a guilty knowledge of the intrigue between Julia the Younger and Silanus, with both of whom he was probably on terms of intimate friendship. Ovid was the poet laureate, not of the court, for Augustus spurned all his overtures, but of the fashionable and depraved society of Rome, which, in the scathing words of Tacitus, existed only to corrupt and be corrupted. Corrumpere et corrumpi saeculum vocant. And thus when Augustus discovered that Ovid had been privy to an intrigue which brought new scandal and disgrace upon the imperial house, he banished to the farthest corner of the Euxine the poet whose libidinous verses he attributed much of the existing depravity. Julia was exiled from Rome. The fate of Silanus is not known. Thus, of the 5 children of Julia and Marcus Agrippa, the 2 eldest sons were dead, the youngest son and elder daughter were in deep disgrace, and only the second daughter, Agrippina, the wife of Germanicus, who was winning golden opinions as a general, was any comfort to the emperor in his declining years. Augustus had now passed his 70th year, and one cannot but pity the central figure in the desolate mansion on the Palatine, who had suffered so many bitter disappointments in the intimacy of his domestic life. His hopes rested upon Tiberius and Germanicus. The one was a man of middle age, the younger was the popular idol of Rome. If Augustus had been spared to greater length of years, it is conceivable that Tiberius might have been supplanted by the son of his dead brother Drusus, whom he had been obliged to adopt as his own son. For it is tolerably clear that there never really was any warmth of feeling between Augustus and Tiberius. Tiberius possessed many sterling and indeed inestimable qualities, but from his earliest days he seems to have been reserved and morose, and Augustus liked to be surrounded by young people who were frank and joyous. Full allowance must be made for the extraordinary embarrassments of Tiberius's position. The stepson saw himself successively passed over in favor of the nephew, the minister, and then the young grandsons. Only when the hand of death had removed the 2 first husbands of the emperor's daughter was he thought worthy of becoming the son-in-law of Augustus, and then he was forced to separate from a wife he loved, to take to his house a woman whose character was a byword in the city. If, as seems probable, the Empress Livia, his mother, had brought him up from his earliest years to the hope for the succession, Tiberius might well be embittered that so many new obstacles from time to time arose in his path, and that his great services to the empire seemed doomed to undergo periods of eclipse. His character is one of the standing puzzles of history, alike in his earlier and later years. But the account of Suetonius seems to be most consonant with the facts as we know them. The prevailing tradition in Rome was that Augustus was repelled by the moroseness of his stepson, and by the gloomy hauteur and reserve which was typical of the Claudian house. It was said that when Tiberius entered a room, all lively conversation was at once checked. His frowning brows made others feel ill at ease. On one occasion, when Tiberius quitted the emperor's chamber, the doorkeepers declared that they heard Augustus exclaim, "I pity the Roman people when they come between those slow-moving jaws. Miserum populum Romanum, qui sub tam lentis maxillis errant." And yet Suetonius pertinently remarks, "I cannot bring myself to believe that in a matter of such momentous importance as the settlement of the succession, such a master of circumspection and prudence as Augustus would have acted rashly." And he states his conviction that the emperor carefully weighed the virtues and vices of his stepson in the balance, and found that the good qualities weighed down the bad. Augustus was right. He adopted Tiberius as his son, not because he was attached to him or in order to please Livia, but for reasons of state, because Tiberius, after the death of Marcus Agrippa, was the strongest man in the empire and its most experienced and capable general. Augustus was cautious, so was Tiberius. He was not likely to embark upon any mad or dangerous enterprise. He had gained sufficient military glory. He had won laurels enough. He would not imperil the empire to win more. Augustus could not fail to respect the man who had stamped out the Pannonian insurrection and made the Rhine bank secure after the disaster to Varus. He might not possess the brilliant qualities or the dash of his brother Drusus, which Drusus had transmitted to his son Germanicus, but he was safe, and Augustus, after the death of his favorite nephew and grandsons, wanted a safe man to succeed him. End of section 20. Section 21 of Augustus Caesar and the Organization of the Empire of Rome by John B. Firth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. The Man and the Statesman. Let us pass to the closing scene. Early in the year 14 AD, Augustus felt that his end was drawing nigh, and ordered that a census of the Roman people should be taken. But hearing of an omen which seemed to portend that he would not live 100 days, he handed over its supervision to Tiberius. When this was completed, Tiberius prepared to leave Rome in order to resume his military command in Illyricum. It was then midsummer, and Augustus determined to journey with him by easy stages towards the Apulian coast. At Astura, the aged emperor caught a chill and suffered from a sharp attack of dysentery. But he rallied, and the two Caesars, after visiting Capreae and Naples, reached Beneventum. There they separated, Tiberius for Brundisium, the port of departure for Illyricum, Augustus for Nola in Campania, where a dangerous relapse set in. Messengers were hastily dispatched by Livia to recall Tiberius. Whether he arrived in time to receive Augustus's last instructions is uncertain, but Livia took care that her husband's death, which the malice of her enemies accused her of hastening, should not be made known to the world until Tiberius was at hand to assume the reins of power. The scene which took place in the dying emperor's bedchamber, the very room in which his father had breathed his last more than 70 years before, is one of the best known in Roman history. On the morning of his death, August 19th, Augustus inquired from those who stood round him whether there was any popular excitement at the gravity of his illness. Then he called for a mirror and bade them arrange his hair and beard, and with a flash of his old irony, asked whether they thought he had played his part well in the farce of life. If so, he added, quoting from Greek comedy, applaud my exit and clap your hands with joy. Lying back upon the pillows, he asked after the health of a sick grandchild of Tiberius, but his last words were to his consort Livia. Livia, live in remembrance of our union, and fare thee well. Euthanasia, the peaceful, painless end for which he had always prayed, was vouchsafed to him, and he passed quietly away without a struggle. What was in the mind of the dying man, no one can say. He may have been merely sporting in gentle irony with the vanities of a human career. The words are mirabales when he spoke of the farce of life, but it is hard to believe that there was not a covert reference to the long intrigues and the furious jealousies which had raged among the members of the imperial family when he adjured Livia to remember that she had been his consort. The simile of the actor leaving the stage was, in his case, marvelously apposite, but the long drama of his life had been tragedy rather than farce. They bore the body to Rome in slow and stately procession, moving only by night to avoid the fierce heat of the August sun. By day it reposed in the local sanctuaries of the villages and cities through which their mournful route lay. At Beauvillais, near the foot of the Alban Hills, the whole equestrian order was waiting to carry the dead chief over the final stage of the journey, and escort him for the last time to his house on the Palatine. The Senate sat in long debate, to discuss the arrangements for a state funeral, and the most preposterous suggestions were put forward. But these were finally set on one side, and it was decided that Augustus should be buried with the stately simplicity which transcends magnificence and pomp. The body was deposited in the Forum, close by the Temple of Mars. Tiberius delivered a panegyric from the principal rostrum, Drusus from another. Then the bier was raised, and the procession of senators, knights, soldiers, and people passed through the Porta Triumphalis to the sacred place without the city where the funeral pyre had been built. The representatives of the legions marched past with the customary funeral evolutions. The torches were applied with averted faces. The flame shot up and consumed the body. From the ashes, extinguished with wine and perfumes, an eagle was seen to soar up to heaven, bearing the soul of the departed. Livia kept solemn watch for 5 days and nights, and then the ashes were carefully collected, placed in an urn, and laid in the splendid imperial mausoleum which Augustus had built in the Campus Martius, and which already contained the ashes of Marcellus and Agrippa, of his sister Octavia, and of the young princes Caius and Lucius. Nerva was the last of the Roman emperors to mingle his dust with that of Augustus. In 410, the Goths ransacked the vaults and scattered the funeral urns. In 1167, the mausoleum, which had served the Colonnas for a fort, was razed to the ground. On bronze pillars, standing at each side of the entrance of the mausoleum, was inscribed the will of Augustus, executed by Livia, Tiberius, Germanicus, and Drusus, his principal heirs. These vanished centuries ago, but copies of the imperial testament were also set up on the walls of certain temples, raised to the memory of Augustus in the provinces, and a curious chance has preserved this celebrated document in marble in the little town of Ancyra in Galatia. The Monumentum Ancyrum, as it is now called, is Augustus's own record of his life and career, and it owes its survival, in this remote corner of the world, to the fact that the Temple of Augustus became successively a Christian church and a Turkish mosque. We have had frequent occasion to refer to its more important clauses in the course of this narrative. Here we need only say that, read as a whole, it is a disappointing document, frigid, false, almost commonplace. In it, Augustus laboriously counts his honors, his benefactions, his doles, his public shows. He narrates the wars he waged, the alliances he concluded, the nations he conquered. In it, too, he traces his rise to supreme power and claims that he has restored the Republic. We would not seem to underestimate the value of the Monumentum Ancyrum or conceal the impression which it leaves upon the mind as the work of a second-rate man. It is indeed almost incredible that the hand which wrote it should have built up the fabric of the Roman Empire. But only in rare cases do men give free play to their imagination when they draw up their wills, and in fairness to Augustus, we should remember that in this, his last speech from the throne, he was addressing a world which scarcely understood his work and had hardly grasped the profound change which had passed over the central organization at Rome. Augustus had never spoken out in his life. He did not speak out in death. We must not judge the greatness of Augustus by the paltry words and thoughts of the Monumentum Ancyrum. We must look elsewhere to discover both the man and the statesman. There are few more interesting pages in Latin literature than those in which Suetonius gives us a personal sketch of Augustus, in the intimate style of the modern paragraphist. It is the only detailed character sketch of the emperor which has survived, Plutarch's life being unfortunately lost. And, in spite of the discredit into which Suetonius has fallen with many modern critics, if we wish to see the real Augustus, the man of flesh and blood, we must still turn to his fascinating notebook. Augustus had a handsome presence, says Suetonius, and retained his good looks throughout his life. In stature, he was rather under middle height, but his limbs were so well proportioned that he seemed taller. His complexion was neither swarthy nor fair. His hair was slightly curled and blonde. His eyebrows met. His nose was high at the crown and drooping at the tip. His teeth were set wide apart and in later years much decayed. His expression was usually serene and tranquil, but his contemporaries chiefly remarked the piercing brilliancy of his eyes. He liked people to think that their brightness was due to some supernatural vigor, and was pleased and flattered when those upon whom he looked intently cast down their eyes, as though unable to sustain the dazzling light which shone from his. Augustus was never physically strong. His left hip and leg were weak and made him walk rather lame, and the index finger of his right hand was subject to cramp, which necessitated his wearing a horn ring for its support when he wrote. He had many long and dangerous illnesses, and was constantly troubled with stone and a disordered liver. Every spring he used to complain of a swelling in the region of his heart, while, when the south winds were prevalent, he was never free from catarrh. The extremes both of heat and cold tried him severely. During the winter he wore, in addition to his thick toga, 4 tunics, a shirt, a woolen chest protector, and stockings, and in summer he slept with his windows wide open, or in the peristyle of his house, with a fountain playing near him and someone to fan him. He was a confirmed valetudinarian, and preferred being rubbed with oil to washing in cold water, and frequently used sea water or warm sulphur water as a tonic. After the civil wars, he entirely gave up horsemanship and military exercises, and took to playing games at ball, but soon afterwards he restricted himself to drives and walks, finishing up with a short burst of running or leaping, with a carriage rug or blanket thrown over him. In later life he traveled in a litter, usually at night, and at such a snail's pace that he would occupy 2 days in making the journey to Tibur or Praeneste, distances of only 18 and 21 miles from Rome. The pleasures of the table had no attraction for him, and his tastes, both in eating and drinking, were of the simplest. He ate when he was hungry, without regard for stated hours, and then his favorite food consisted of coarse bread, small fish, cheese made of goat's milk, and green figs. No Jew ever keeps his Sabbath fast. He once wrote to Tiberius, "As strictly as I have done today. I only ate 2 mouthfuls in the bath from the first hour of the night until my man came to anoint me." Thus, though he entertained constantly, he often sat at table without touching anything, and took food either before his guests came or after they had departed. His dinners were short, consisting, as a rule, of 3 courses only, and of 6 at the most. But they were bright and lively, for Augustus liked the conversation to be general, and often called in reciters, actors, and even pantomimists from the circus to amuse the company. Wine he took most sparingly, rarely drinking except at dinner, and quenching his thirst, between times, with a little bread steeped in cold water, a slice of cucumber, a leaf of lettuce, or a juicy apple. After the midday meal he would rest a while, with a wrap thrown over his feet, and shading his eyes with his hand. After dinner he used to finish his day's work, and then betake himself to bed. He allowed himself 7 hours sleep, but he usually woke 3 or 4 times during the night, and if he found any difficulty in falling off to sleep again, he used to send for someone to read to him or tell him stories. His personal tastes were those of a simple citizen. In his younger days he had been bitten by a prevailing craze for Corinthian bronzes and rare furniture, and it was said that some of the victims of the Great Proscription owed their inclusion in the fatal list to their rich collections of bronzes which Augustus coveted. He changed as he grew older. Out of all the spoils of Alexandria, he only reserved for himself a single murrhine vase, and he melted down the gold vessels which had been in use in his household. His mansion on the Palatine was one of the most modest in Rome, and for more than 40 years he used the same bedchamber both in summer and winter. He had a small detached building erected in the grounds, to which he retired when he wished to be undisturbed, and if he felt unwell he often went to sleep in Maecenas' house on the Esquiline. His country villas at Lanuvium, Praeneste, and Tibur were on the same unpretentious scale, and he razed to the ground a luxurious villa which had been built by his daughter Julia. His statues and pictures were nothing to boast of, and his furniture was commonplace and undistinguished, but he took a great interest in planting avenues and beautifying his grounds, and he had the antiquarian's eye for fragments of ancient art and sculpture. His beds and tables were long carefully preserved, to show the simplicity which had contented the founder of the empire. His personal attire was equally destitute of distinction. He wore nothing which had not been woven by the members of his own family, and the only vanity he permitted himself was that the soles of his shoes were rather thicker than usual, in order to add a little to his height. His chief amusement was playing at dice, but he played merely for pastime, caring nothing whether he won or lost. Suetonius preserves a curious fragment of a letter written by the emperor to Tiberius, in which he says, "We spent the festival of Minerva quite pleasantly, for we kept the dice board warm and played all day long. Your brother did a lot of shouting as he played, but in the end he did not lose much, for after standing to lose heavily, he gradually retrieved his position. I dropped 20,000 numi, but that was because I played with my usual reckless generosity. If I had insisted on being paid on the coups, which I bought off, or had kept the money which I gave to those at the table with me, I would have won as much as 50,000. But I like my way best, for my kind-heartedness will win me a heavenly crown of glory." Occasionally he angled a little, and as we have seen in another chapter, he was a devoted and regular patron of the public shows and all manner of theatrical entertainments. But Suetonius discloses a much more amiable trait in the emperor's character when he describes how he delighted in the company of little children, and joined in the games which they played with marbles and nuts. Moorish and Syrian children, who were brought to the palace for his amusement, pleased him most. He liked their pretty faces and their prattling talk. Like most of the cultured Romans of his day, he enjoyed the study of rhetoric and the humanities. He had taken great pains in his younger years to become a good speaker, and even during the anxieties of the campaign of Mutina, had never let a day pass without devoting some hours to reading, writing, and declamation. He spoke in a natural voice, which was pleasant to listen to, and did not lack for fluency. But it was characteristic of the man that he was afraid of his memory playing him false, and of letting fall an incautious word, and subsequently he invariably prepared his speeches beforehand and wrote them out on paper. For important interviews with single individuals, and even with his wife Livia, a fact suggestive of scenes in the imperial family, he followed the same plan, lest he should say a word too much or too little. He was a purist in his choice of language, detesting anything approaching to affectation in style, and it was his special care to make his meaning as clear as possible. He used to chaff Maecenas for his precocity of diction and Tiberius for his anachronisms, while Marcus Antonius he described as a madman who strove to make people stare instead of writing what they could understand. "Do you think," he said, "that we want the empty, senseless gush of Asiatic rhetoricians introduced into our everyday speech?" We have seen how he taught his young grandsons, Caius and Lucius, to imitate his handwriting. To their little sister Agrippina he wrote, "You must do your very best not to be affected when you write or speak." Like Lord Palmerston, he was intolerant of a badly written dispatch, and he once summarily dismissed a legate of consular rank from his post for writing ixi instead of ipsi. Such a clumsy and illiterate boor was unfit for his service, and he sent him a successor. Suetonius expresses surprise at this story, for he notes that Augustus often spelt words phonetically and changed not only single letters but whole syllables. But emperors were privileged persons, and supra grammaticum. Augustus aspired to authorship, and used to read his compositions to a select company of friends, following the fashion which had been newly introduced by Asinius Pollio. We need not perhaps regret the loss of his exhortation to the study of philosophy, but the reply to Brutus on the subject of Cato, and the history of my life, the latter in 13 books, covering his career down to the Spanish expedition, would have been of invaluable assistance to the historians of this period. Poetry he essayed, but rather as an exercise than as a serious study. A poem on Sicily, a volume of epigrams, and an unfinished tragedy dealing with the story of Ajax comprised his entire efforts in this direction. He started the tragedy with great zest, but his pen did not run fluently. "How is Ajax getting on?" his friends asked. "Ajax has fallen upon his sponge," was the neat reply. Doubtless Augustus was wise to cheat the critics of an easy prey. He had studied Greek learning and philosophy in his youth under Apollodorus of Pergamum. Arius of Alexandria was one of his most intimate friends, and the two sons of Arius, Dionysius and Nicanor, dwelt with him on the Palatine. Yet we are told that whenever he had occasion to write in Greek, he set down in Latin what he wished to say, and then handed it over to one of his Greek secretaries to be translated. Probably he was afraid of committing some solecism, which might be turned into ridicule by his sharp-tongued Eastern subjects. Suetonius adds another detail which is intensely characteristic of Augustus. Whenever, in the course of his reading, he came upon a passage containing a useful sentiment or maxim which tended to edification, he had it copied out and sent it to such of his court officials and provincial governors as needed a word in season. It was ever one of the emperor's foibles to believe that he could work moral revolutions by setting his people good copybook headlines. There is a dark side, however, to the character of Augustus, which cannot be glossed over. Whether, in his earlier years, he had been guilty of the gross offenses attributed to him, we cannot tell. Such charges were recklessly made. Scarcely anyone who rose to eminence escaped them. On this point, he may fairly be given the benefit of the doubt, and the benefit also of the enormous difference between the moral standards of his time and those of our own. But the indulgence which is granted to youth cannot be extended indefinitely to manhood and age, and the private life of the emperor has justly fallen under the lash of the moralist. The moral hypocrite is always odious and contemptible, and the irregularities of Augustus were notorious and beyond denial. Scribonia, it was said, had complained that his mistresses were more powerful than herself. She was divorced. Livia was more astute. Failing as she did to bear him children, she connived at, and according to the gossip of the day, even ministered to his passions, in order to retain her influence over him. His friends put forward the despicable excuse that Augustus intrigued with the wives of those whom he distrusted, in order that he might learn their secrets, and so sought to justify his adultery by pleading the necessities of statecraft. The plea merely aggravates the offense. There is nothing surprising in the failure of an emperor to observe his own edicts, when these edicts are directed against immorality, or in the violent anger displayed by a licentious parent at the licentiousness of his child. Such phenomena are common enough. But what is surprising in the case of Augustus is that in every other respect he was ascetic and puritanical. There are indeed those who believe that his whole career was a lie, that his austerity of life was assumed for effect, that his call to the age to revert to ancient ideals was a sham, and that his zeal for religion was sheer hypocrisy. The theory is simple, but it solves the difficulty much too easily to carry conviction, and this assuredly is not the explanation of so sphinx-like a personality. On the contrary, it is more probable that Augustus belonged to that numerous class of men who see the right course and pursue it, but with frequent lapses into the wrong. It scarcely required that Augustus should be a pattern of virtue for him to realize whither Roman society was drifting, or indeed had already drifted. He was a moral reformer because moral reform was imperative. He was the author of the Lex Julia de Adulteris because the times required such a law. The beam in his own eye did not destroy his vision. He was essentially religious and superstitious, and these qualities have often been associated with profligacy. He was also an ascetic. Human nature is capable of endless combinations, but the conjunction of asceticism and licentiousness is so rare that, when it is met with, it is hardly recognized, and men are tempted to deny either one quality or the other. Yet such was the character of Augustus. In this one respect, he was a moral hypocrite. In all others, his moral zeal was sincere, though it was inspired perhaps by reasons of state and careful calculation rather than by personal enthusiasm for morality. We have already dwelt upon his strong family affections, as displayed in his tender regard for his sister Octavia and her son Marcellus, in his love for his daughter Julia, and in his devotion to her two eldest boys. He was also a faithful friend. It was not easy to win his friendship, but once obtained, it was sure. He not only, says Suetonius, suitably rewarded the virtues and merits of his intimates, but bore with their failures and shortcomings as long as they were not too flagrant. Vitia quoque et delictia, dum taxit modica, perpessus. Salvidianus Rufus and Cornelius Gallus were the only two of his friends who fell into deep disgrace. With the rest, there might be temporary estrangements, as with Maecenas and Agrippa. But though they lost the emperor's confidence, he did not pursue them with the vindictiveness which it is the usual fate of a disgraced minister to suffer. Augustus was no gloomy and solitary tyrant, dwelling apart from his fellow men. He craved for friendship and its outward manifestations. When his intimates died, he expected to be mentioned in their wills and carefully scrutinized the words in which they referred to him in their last testaments. The legacies themselves were quite a secondary consideration. He usually relinquished them to the next of kin, or if the heirs were minors, he kept the money until they were of age and then handed it over with substantial increase. Such anxiety to be appreciated may be a weakness, but it is at least a human weakness. In his household, he was strict but forgiving and an easy master to serve. He employed a number of freedmen, many of whom gained his complete confidence. Occasionally, indeed, his punishments were of great severity, yet all men spoke with praise of his wonderful clemency. The clemency of Augustus passed into a proverb, in spite of the great proscription. He had climbed to power over the dead bodies of those who stood in his path. Other conquerors had done the same. If he had lost, his life too would have been forfeited. But once secure, he spared the enemies from whom he had nothing to fear. He sought to conciliate his opponents, to disarm the discontented. He did not repress criticism or punish those who attacked him with speech or pamphlet. Once when Tiberius wrote to him advocating repressive measures, Augustus replied, "Do not, my dear Tiberius, let your youthful impetuosity run away with you in such a matter, nor allow your indignation to run riot because someone speaks injuriously of me. It is enough if we can make sure that no one can do us an injury." There spoke the statesman. In modern phrase, Augustus saw the folly of sitting on the safety valve. Thus he tolerated opposition so long as it was not armed and could inflict no deadly wound. And when, on one occasion, the lampooners scattered copies of their scurrilous verses in the Senate House, he merely suggested that the Senate should, at some later date, discuss the advisability of punishing the anonymous publication of libel. Many interesting stories are told of his tolerance. We hear, for example, of someone shouting in the Senate, "I don't understand you," as Augustus was speaking; of another interrupting him with the words, "I would contradict you if I had an opportunity," and of the cry, "There ought to be free speech in the Senate," when he angrily quitted the chamber after a heated and stormy scene. More amusing are the stories told of Antistius Labeo, one of the characters of Rome, who scarcely took the trouble to conceal his republican sympathies. When the Senate voted the emperor a senatorial guard of honor to watch outside his bedchamber, Labeo dryly remarked that he was unsuitable for the dignity, for he snored and might disturb the emperor's sleep. Again, at the revision of the Senate, Labeo voted for the inclusion of Marcus Lepidus, then in exile. "Is there no one more worthy?" asked Augustus with a frown. "Each man has a right to his own opinion," was the ready reply. When Messala Corvinus resigned the prefecture of the city, after holding it only for 6 days, with the remark that he knew not how to exercise a power which was inimical to liberty, Augustus took no offense. He simply conferred the office upon another who had fewer scruples. He was affable and accessible to all. His doors were always open, and he received even the humblest with a gracious kindliness. The title of Dominus he forbade by special edict, and would not allow his favorite grandchildren to address him by that name, even in jest. Once when a supplicant handed him a petition with a clumsy and exaggerated show of deference, the emperor wittily remarked that he might be offering a halfpenny to an elephant. Augustus was considerate in all things. To prevent public inconvenience, he usually entered or quitted the city by night, so that his friends might not feel obliged to escort him, after the Roman fashion, to or from the gates. Yet he himself observed with exactitude all the punctilio of Roman etiquette, and never missed honoring his friends with his presence at their houses when they were keeping festivals of birth or marriage. Only in his later years, after being mobbed at a marriage function, did he perform by proxy the offices of friendship. His palace was scarcely a palace in the modern sense of the term. The paraphernalia of a court and the host of court officials, with purely ceremonial duties, were introduced after his death, or were to be found in the adjoining house of Livia. Augustus's palace was rather the central bureau of the empire, where the emperor worked and where he also happened to live. It is perhaps an easier task to estimate Augustus as a statesman than as a man, for there is one supreme test question which we can put to all great rulers. It is this: what have they done for their country? If we strike the balance between the good and the evil which they wrought, and no important political changes can be effected without destroying much that is worth preservation, does the good outweigh the evil? Let us apply this test to Augustus and his work. He destroyed the Republic. He founded the Roman Empire. There are those who regard this as an inexpiable crime. They are tempted to forget the vices of the Republic because they were associated with free institutions, and the virtues of the empire because they were associated with absolutism. But those who take this view ought to be able to show that the Republic was capable of being reformed and reorganized from within, that the Senate and the Comitia were capable of dealing with the new world problems which were demanding solution, and that there was at least a reasonable chance of a working arrangement being arrived at between them, whereby the affairs of the state might be efficiently administered. But this is precisely what cannot be shown. We look in vain for any indication in the last 50 years of the Republic that either the old oligarchical families or the popular party would have risen to a broad conception of what the Roman world required. The Optimates formed a narrow clique, jealous only of their class privileges. The supremacy of the Populares meant mob rule, pure and simple. Such a system could not be made efficient by peaceful constitutional reform. It needed to be transformed by violent methods. Julius had recognized this. Augustus recognized it also. But he sought to conceal the transformation as much as possible by retaining the ancient forms. He spoke of the Principate as though it were merely another magistracy in the Republic. He established a diarchy, dividing the government of the world between himself and the Senate, but every year that passed made this diarchy more and more a sham. The Principate at the death of Augustus was an empire in everything but in name. Let it be granted, then, that what Augustus established was, if we look merely at names and their strict meaning, a sham and a fraud. But a constitution may be a sham, and yet, in Carlyle's phrase, it may march. Some of the most perfectly logical paper constitutions have proved the most appalling failures. Some of the least logical have succeeded best and lasted longest. The divergence between theory and practice, on which we have laid stress in previous chapters, and to which the hostile critics of Augustus point as though it were a conclusive and unanswerable condemnation of his system, is a familiar feature of the British, and indeed of every unwritten constitution. Yet the smooth working of the British Constitution, in spite of its being a tangled mess of contradictions, is the envy of many states whose constitutions are masterpieces of logical ingenuity. So though the diarchy of Augustus was an imposture, for the division of power between the Senate and the Principate was an unequal division, it yet served its purpose. It smoothed the process of transition from republic to empire. It gratified the susceptibilities of the republican senators. It solved wounded pride. It disarmed, during the most critical years, active opposition. Augustus was a typical opportunist in politics, and the name carries with it a certain reproach. Yet every great statesman who has accomplished anything permanent has found himself obliged to play the part of the opportunist, to make allowances for prejudice and ignorance, to flatter the vanity of his opponents, and to conciliate their wrath by timely concessions. So long as he is guided by some great principle tending to the general welfare of the state, such opportunism is really only another name for the statecraft which is an essential feature of statesmanship. And Augustus possessed such a guiding principle, which may be summed up in one word: order. He set the Roman world in order. Those who contemptuously dismiss him as a man of second-rate intelligence assuredly forget the magnitude of that task. His is not a heroic figure. Our sympathies are not irresistibly drawn towards him as they are to the brilliant and versatile Julius. Indeed, he repels rather than attracts. He excites cold approval and respect, but kindles no enthusiasm. He was not a visionary or a dreamer. There was no touch of the practical mystic in him which we find in men like Napoleon or Cromwell. He was, so far as politics were concerned, wholly practical and without imagination. But these, after all, were the qualities most requisite in the statesman who undertook to tidy up the Roman world from the chaos in which it had been left by the civil wars. He succeeded perfectly, and he was, throughout his reign, rather the managing director of the empire than its emperor. We think of Augustus not as a dazzling central figure upon a throne, and not as the commander-in-chief of the scattered Roman legions on the Tagus, the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates, and the Nile, but as the businessman in his private room in the palace grounds, clad in a workaday dress of homespun, busy with dispatches from his agents abroad. The well-known lines of Horace give us the truest picture of Augustus. Quum tot Sistinius et tanta negotia solas, res Italis armis tuteris, moribus ornes, legibus emendes, in publica commoda pecam, si longo sermone, moror tu tempora Caesar. And he was no Philip II of Spain, patiently and conscientiously blinding himself over official detail which his dull wit could not grasp. Love of detail was his second nature, and the detail all formed part of his great scheme of order and efficiency. Voltaire once described Augustus as un monstre adroit et huer, an excellent example of misapplied terseness of expression, yet containing just a few grains of truth. The cold-blooded calculation and adroitness displayed by Augustus after the Battle of Mutina, when he was still in his teens, and his sanction of the Great Proscription may almost justify the word monster. But he was then a gamester playing for his life against even more reckless gamesters who were playing for theirs. It was no time for generosity. As Antonius had said, "Only the winner will live." But it is absurd to judge the Emperor Augustus, who died at the age of 76, by his actions before he was 21, to remember only the proscription and forget that he was known to his countrymen for centuries as the magnanimous and the clement. Calculating and adroit he remained to the end, but these qualities spell statesmanship, and as for his luck, luck in politics is usually the reward of competence and capacity. We must take the current when it serves, or lose our ventures. Augustus took it, Antonius did not. Fortune certainly favored him, and the phrase "sis felicior Augusto" became the recognized salutation to the throne. But he deserved fortune because he put himself in fortune's way. He owed nothing to good luck in his patient reorganization of the empire, while others would have remained in Rome to enjoy in ease the fruits of victory. Augustus spent many years in journeying through his dominions and setting the crooked straight. He gave peace within the empire by battering down all opposition. His methods were often ruthless. They must have caused untold misery among the natives of Spain, northern Italy, and Gaul, for he transported whole tribes from their native homes and sold whole races into slavery. Yet civilization has reaped the benefit. The rapid and permanent Romanization of Gaul and Spain was the grand result, in the presence of which history either ignores or condones the crime. We have said that Augustus was without imagination. Perhaps that is too sweeping a judgment to pass upon the man who rebuilt Rome on so splendid a scale. Yet even here we suspect that his main idea was to impress the imagination of others. The grandeur of Rome was a great business asset of the empire. It flattered the pride of the Romans. It created a sense of awe among the provincials. It was a sort of visible guarantee that the new regime had come to stay. But we suspect that the emperor took a keener interest in the reports of the Tiber Conservancy Board and the construction of the great military roads over the Alps than he did in the completion of various amphitheaters and temples which rose under his guidance in the capital. It was the practical side of the great imperial idea which appealed most to him. Efficient government, safe frontiers, the opening of new trade routes, and a full exchequer. To secure those was his constant occupation. He had, in a word, the practical imagination which goes to make a successful businessman and a practical statesman. Chateaubriand has said that Augustus did not belong to the select company of that first class of men who make revolutions, but rather to the second class who profit by them. There is much truth in that saying. If there had been no Julius, there would have been no Augustus. But this does not derogate from his greatness. His work endured. There lies the justification. He built up the Principate, which became gradually transformed into the empire. If liberty died in Rome, the capital, a new life arose in the provinces of the West and in Africa. The Hellenism of the eastern portion of the empire endured as before. It was no part of the Roman mission to destroy the Hellenistic civilization and replace it by the Roman. Such an attempt was never made. If it had been, it must have failed. What then was the main result of his work? The answer is clear. He knitted together the Roman world, east and west, into one great organization of which the emperor stood as the supreme head. He set his legions upon the distant frontiers, and their swords formed a wall of steel within which commerce and peace might flourish. The security was not perpetual, yet it lasted for 4 centuries, and saved ancient civilization from destruction. But for the empire and the system inaugurated by Augustus, there is every probability that the Roman civilization would have been as thoroughly wiped out in Gaul and Spain as it was in northern Africa, and as the civilization of Greece was blotted out in Asia Minor and Syria. We may regret the degeneration of Rome, its loss of freedom, the tyranny of the later emperors, the civil wars which followed, and the decay of the old martial spirit in the Roman people. But the seeds of degeneration and decay had been planted in the days of the Republic, and would have come to maturity far sooner if there had been no Augustus and no empire. Augustus started the Roman world on a new career. He made it realize its unity for the first time. That was his life work, and its consequences are felt to this day. End of section 21. End of Augustus Caesar and the Organization of the Empire of Rome by John B. Firth.